morning, everyone. This is the fifth in a series of public hearings the committee will be holding as part of the House of Representatives impeachment inquiry. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. There is a quorum present. We will proceed today in the same fashion as our other hearings. I'll make an opening statement, and then Ranking Member Nunes will have the opportunity to make a statement. Then we will turn to our witness for an opening statement, and then to questions. For audience members, we welcome you and respect your interest in being here. In turn, we ask for your respect as we proceed with today's hearing. It is the intention of the committee to proceed without disruptions. As chairman, I'll make all necessary and appropriate steps to maintain order and to ensure the committee is run in accordance with House rules and House Resolution 660. With that, I now recognize myself to give an opening statement in the impeachment inquiry into Donald J. Trump, the 45th President of the United States. This morning, we will hear from Gordon Sondland, the American ambassador to the European Union. We are here today as part of the House of Representatives impeachment inquiry because President Donald Trump sought to condition military aid to Ukraine in an Oval Office meeting with the new Ukrainian President, Volodymyr Zelensky, in exchange for politically motivated investigations that Trump believed would help his re-election campaign. The first investigation was of a discredited conspiracy theory that Ukraine, not Russia, was responsible for interfering in the 2016 election. The second investigation that Trump demanded was into a political rival that he apparently feared most, Joe Biden. Trump sought to weaken Biden and to refute the fact that his own election campaign in 2016 had been helped by a Russian hacking and dumping operation and Russian social media campaign directed by Vladimir Putin to help Trump. Trump's scheme undermined military and diplomatic support for a key ally and undercut U.S. anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine. Trump put his personal and political interests above those of the United States. As Ambassador Sondland would later tell career Foreign Service officer David Holmes immediately after speaking to the president, Trump did not give an expletive about Ukraine. He cares about big stuff that benefits him, like the Biden investigations that Rudy Giuliani was pushing. Ambassador Sondland was a skilled deal maker, but in trying to satisfy a directive from the president, found himself increasingly embroiled in an effort to press the new Ukrainian president that deviated sharply from the norm in both terms of policy and process. In February, Ambassador Sondland traveled to Ukraine on his first official trip to that country. While in Kyiv, he met with then U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine, Marie Yovanovitch, and found her to be an excellent diplomat with a deep command of Ukrainian internal dynamics. On April 21st, Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine and spoke to President Trump, who congratulated him and said he would look into attending Zelensky's inauguration, but pledged to send someone at a very, very high level. Between the time of that call and the inaugural on May 20, Trump's attitude towards Ukraine hardened. On May 13th, the president ordered Vice President Mike Pence not to attend Zelensky's inauguration, opting instead to dispatch the self-dubbed Three Amigos, Energy Secretary Rick Perry, Ambassador Sondland, and Ambassador Kurt Volker, the Special Representative for Ukraine negotiations. After returning from the inauguration, members of the U.S. delegation briefed President Trump on their encouraging first interactions with the new Ukrainian administration. They urged the president to meet with Zelensky, but the president's reaction was decidedly hostile. The president's order was clear, however: talk with Rudy. During this meeting, Ambassador Sondland first became aware of what Giuliani and the president were really interested in. This whole thing was sort of a continuum, he testified at his deposition, starting at the May 23rd meeting, ending up at the end of the line when the transcript of the call came out. It was a continuum, he would explain, that became more insidious over time. The Three Amigos were disappointed with Trump's directive to engage Giuliani, but vowed to press ahead. Ambassador Sondland testified, "We could abandon the goal of a White House meeting for President Zelensky, which the group deemed crucial for U.S.-Ukrainian relations, or we could do as President Trump directed and talk to Mr. Giuliani to address the president's concerns. We chose the latter path." In the coming weeks, Ambassador Sondland got more clearly involved in Ukraine policymaking, starting with the June 4 U.S. mission to the EU Independence Day event in Brussels 1 month early. Secretary Perry, Ulbricht Breckbull, and the State Department counselor and Sondland met with President Zelensky, whom Sondland had invited personally on the margins of the event. On June 10, 2019, Secretary Perry organized a conference call with Sondland, then National Security Advisor John Bolton, Volker, and others. They reviewed Ukraine's strategy with Bolton and decided that Perry, Sondland, and Volker would assist Ambassador Bill Taylor, the new acting ambassador in Kyiv, on Ukraine, and discuss Trump's desire for Rudy Giuliani to be somehow involved. At the end of the call, according to Sondland, we all felt very comfortable with the strategy moving forward. 2 weeks later, on June 27th, Ambassador Sondland called Taylor to say that, quote, Zelensky needed to make clear to President Trump that he was not standing in the way of investigations. On July 10th, Ambassador Sondland and other U.S. officials met at the White House with a group of U.S. and Ukrainian officials. Participants in the meeting have told us that Ambassador Sondland invoked acting White House Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney and said that the White House meeting sought by the Ukrainian president with Trump would happen only if Ukraine undertook certain investigations. National Security Advisor Bolton abruptly ended the meeting upon hearing this. Undeterred, Sondland brought the Ukrainian delegation downstairs to another part of the White House and was more explicit. According to witnesses, Ukraine needed to investigate the Bidens or Burisma and the 2016 election interference if they wanted to get a meeting at all. Following this meeting in July, Bolton said that he would not be part of whatever drug deal Sondland and Mulvaney are cooking up on this. Sondland continued to press for a meeting, but he and others were willing to settle for a phone call as an intermediate step. On July 21, Taylor texted Sondland that, quote, President Zelensky is sensitive about Ukraine being taken seriously, not merely as an instrument of Washington domestic re-election politics. Sondland responded, absolutely. But we need to get the conversation started and the relationship built, irrespective of the pretext, so that Zelensky and Trump could meet and all of this will be fixed. On July 25th, the day of the Trump-Zelensky call, Volker had lunch in Kyiv with a senior aide to Ukrainian President Zelensky and later texted the aide to say that he'd heard from the White House, assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for a visit to Washington. Good luck. Ambassador Sondland spoke to President Trump a few minutes before the call was placed, but was not on the call. During that now infamous phone call with Zelensky, Trump responded to the Ukrainian expression of appreciation for U.S. defense support and request to buy more Javelin anti-tank missiles by saying, I would like you to do us a favor, though. Trump asked Zelensky to investigate the discredited 2016 conspiracy theory and, even more ominously, look into the Bidens. Neither had been part of the official preparatory material for the call, but they were in Donald Trump's personal interest and the interests of his re-election campaign. And the Ukrainian president knew about both in advance, in part because of Ambassador Volker and Ambassador Sondland's efforts to make him aware of what the president was demanding. Around this time, Ambassador Sondland became aware of the suspension of security assistance to Ukraine, which had been announced on a secure interagency video conference on July 18th, telling us that it was extremely odd that nobody involved in making and implementing policy towards Ukraine knew why the aid had been put on hold. During August, Sondland participated in conference calls and text messages with Volker and Giuliani and said that the gist of every call was what was going to go in the press statement. In an August 9 text message with Volker, Sondland stated, I think POTUS really wants the deliverable, which was, according to Sondland, a deliverable public statement that President Trump wanted to see or hear before a White House meeting could happen. On September 1, Ambassador Sondland participated in Vice President Pence's bilateral meeting with Zelensky in Warsaw, during which Zelensky raised the suspended security assistance. Following that meeting, Sondland approached a senior Ukrainian official to tell him that he believed what could help them move the aid was if the Ukrainian prosecutor general would go to the mic and announce that he was opening the Burisma investigation. Sondland told Taylor that he had made a mistake by telling the Ukrainians that an Oval Office meeting was dependent on a public announcement of investigations. In fact, everything was dependent on such an announcement, including security assistance. But even the announcement by the Prosecutor General would not satisfy the President. On September 7, Sondland spoke to the President and told Tim Morrison and Bill Taylor about the call shortly thereafter. The President said that although this was not a quid pro quo, if President Zelensky did not clear things up in public, we would be at a stalemate. Moreover, an announcement by the Prosecutor General would not be enough. President Zelensky must announce personally that he would open the investigations. Sondland told Taylor that President Trump is a businessman. When a businessman is about to sign a check to someone who owes him something, he said the businessman asked that person to pay up before signing the check. The check referred to here was the U.S. military assistance to Ukraine, and Ukraine had to pay up with investigations. Throughout early September, Volker and Sondland sought to close the deal on an agreement that Zelensky would announce investigations. After Taylor texted Sondland on September 9, 2019, that I think it's crazy to withhold security assistance for help with a political campaign. 16 days later, the transcript of the July 25th call was made public, and the American people learned the truth of how our president tried to take advantage of a vulnerable ally. Now it is up to Congress, as the people's representatives, to determine what response is appropriate. If the president abused his power and invited foreign interference in our elections, if he sought to condition, coerce, extort, or bribe an ally into conducting investigations to aid his re-election campaign, and did so by withholding official acts, a White House meeting, or hundreds of millions of dollars of needed military aid, it will be up to us to decide whether those acts are compatible with the office of the presidency. Finally, I want to say a word about the President and Secretary Pompeo's obstruction of this investigation. We have not received a single document from the State Department, and as Ambassador Sondland's opening statement today will make clear, those documents bear directly on this investigation and this impeachment inquiry. I think we know now, based on a sample of the documents attached to Ambassador Sondland's statement, that the knowledge of this scheme was far and wide, and included, among others, Secretary of State Pompeo, as well as the Vice President. We can see why Secretary Pompeo and President Trump have made such a concerted and across-the-board effort to obstruct this investigation and this impeachment inquiry. And I will just say this, they do so at their own peril. I remind the President that Article 3 of the impeachment articles drafted against President Nixon was his refusal to obey the subpoenas of Congress. And with that, I recognize Ranking Member Nunes for any remarks that he would wish to make.
Thank the gentleman. As we learned last night, story time last night, we get story time first thing this morning. Ambassador Sondland, welcome. Glad you're here. Well, I'm really not glad you're here, but welcome to the fifth day of this circus. As I've noted before, the Democrats on this committee spent 3 years accusing President Trump of being a Russian agent. In March 2018, after a year-long investigation, Intelligence Committee Republicans issued a 240-page report describing in detail how the Russians meddled in the 2016 elections and making specific recommendations to improve our election security. Denouncing the report as a whitewash and accusing Republicans of subverting the investigation, the Democrats issued their own report, focusing on their now debunked conspiracy theory that the Trump campaign colluded with Russia to hack the elections. Notably, the Democrats vowed at the time to present a further, quote, comprehensive report, unquote, after they finished their investigation into Trump's treasonous collusion with Russia. For some completely inexplicable reason, after the implosion of their Russia hoax, the Democrats failed to issue that comprehensive report. We're still waiting. This episode shows how the Democrats have exploited the Intelligence Committee for political purposes for 3 years, culminating in these impeachment hearings in their mania to attack the president. No conspiracy theory is too outlandish for the Democrats. Time and time again, they floated the possibility of some far-fetched malfeasance by Trump, declared the dire need to investigate it, and then suddenly dropped the issue and moved on to their next asinine theory. A sampling of their accusations and insinuations includes these. Trump is a longtime Russian agent, as described in the Steele dossier. The Russians gave Trump advance access to emails stolen by the DNC and the Hillary Clinton campaign. The Trump campaign based some of its activities on these stolen documents. Trump received nefarious materials from the Russians through a Trump campaign aide. Trump laundered Russian money through real estate deals. Trump was blackmailed by Russia through his financial exposure with Deutsche Bank. Trump had a diabolical plan to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. Trump changed the Republican National Committee platform to hurt Ukraine and benefit Russia. The Russians laundered money through the NRA for the Trump campaign. Trump's son-in-law lied about his Russian contacts while obtaining his security clearance. It's a long list of charges, all false, and I could go on and on and on, but I'll spare you for these moments. Clearly, these ludicrous accusations don't reflect committee members who are honestly searching for the truth. They are the actions of partisan extremists who hijacked the Intelligence Committee, transformed it into the Impeachment Committee, abandoned its core oversight functions, and turned it into a beachhead for ousting an elected president from office. You have to keep that history in mind as you consider the Democrats' latest catalog of supposed Trump outrages. Granted, a friendly call with the Ukrainian president wouldn't seem to rise to the same level as being a Russian agent, but the Democrats were running out of time. If they waited any longer, their impeachment circus would intervene with their own candidates' 2020 campaigns. So you have to give them points for creativity in selling this absurdity as an impeachable offense. All this explains why the Democrats have gathered zero Republican support in the House of Representatives for their impeachment crusade. In fact, the vote we held was a bipartisan vote against this impeachment inquiry. Speaker Pelosi, Chairman Schiff, and Chairman Nadler, the key figures behind this impeachment crusade, all proclaimed that impeachment is so damaging to the country that it can only proceed with bipartisan support. Are those declarations suddenly no longer true? Did impeachment become less divisive? Of course not. They know exactly what kind of damage they're inflicting on this nation, but they've passed the point of no return. After 3 years of preparation work, much of it spearheaded by the Democrats on this committee, using all the tools of Congress to accuse, investigate, indict, and smear the president, they stoked a frenzy amongst their most fanatical supporters that they can no longer control. Ambassador Sondland, you are here today to be smeared. But you'll make it through it, and I appreciate your service to this country, and I'm sorry that you've had to go through this. In closing, the Democrats have zeroed in on an anonymous whistleblower complaint that was cooked up in cooperation with the Democrats on this very committee. They lied to the American people about that cooperation and refused to let us question the whistleblower to discover the truth. Meanwhile, the Democrats lash out against anyone who questions or casts doubt on this spectacle. When Ukrainian President Zelensky denies anything improper happened on the phone call, the Democrats say that he's a liar. When journalists report on Ukraine election meddling and Hunter Biden's position on the board of corrupt Ukrainian companies, the Democrats label them conspiracy theorists. When the Democrats can't get any traction for their allegations of quid pro quo, they move the goalposts and accuse the president of extortion, then bribery, and at last resort, obstruction of justice. The American people sent us to Washington to solve problems, not to wage scorched earth political warfare against the other party. This impeachment is not helping the American people. It's not a legitimate use of taxpayer dollars, and it's definitely not improving our national security. Finally, the Democrats' fake outrage that President Trump used his own channel to communicate with Ukraine. I'll remind my friends on the other side of the aisle that our first president, George Washington, directed his own diplomatic channels to secure a treaty with Great Britain. If my Democratic colleagues were around in 1794, they'd probably want to impeach him too. Mr. Chairman, this morning we have transmitted to you a letter exercising our rights under HRS 660 to subpoena documents and witnesses. We take this step because you have failed to ensure fairness and objectivity in this inquiry. As such, we need to subpoena Hunter Biden and the whistleblower for closed-door depositions, as well as relevant documents from the DNC, Hunter Biden's firm, Rosemont Zeneca, and the whistleblower. In the interest of some basic level of fairness, we expect you to concur with these subpoenas. And I'll submit that letter for the record and yield back the balance of my time.
I thank the gentleman. We are joined this afternoon by Ambassador Gordon Sondland. This morning. It was a long day yesterday. Gordon Sondland is the U.S. representative to the European Union with the rank of ambassador. Before joining the State Department, Ambassador Sondland was the founder and CEO of Providence Hotels, a national owner and operator of full-service hotels. Also prior to his government service, Ambassador Sondland was engaged in charitable enterprises. Two final points before our witness is sworn. First, witness depositions as part of this inquiry were unclassified in nature, and all open hearings will also be held at the unclassified level. Any information that may touch on classified information will be addressed separately. Second, Congress will not tolerate any reprisal, threat of reprisal, or attempt to retaliate against any U.S. government official for testifying before Congress, including you or any of your colleagues. If you would please rise and raise your right hand, I will begin by swearing you in. Do you swear or affirm that the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show the witness has answered in the affirmative. Thank you, and please be seated. The microphone is sensitive, so please speak directly into it. Without objection, your written statement will be made part of the record, and with that, Ambassador Sondland, you are now recognized for your opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Nunes. I appreciate the opportunity to speak again to the members of this committee. First, let me offer my thanks to the men and women of the U.S. Department of State who have committed their professional lives to support the foreign policy work of the United States. In particular, I want to thank my staff at the U.S. Mission to the European Union. Your integrity, dedication, and hard work, often performed without public acclaim or recognition, serve as a shining example of true public service, and I am personally grateful to work beside you each and every day. It is my honor to serve as the U.S. Ambassador to the European Union. The U.S. mission to the EU is the direct link between the United States and the European Union and its members, America's longest-standing allies and one of the largest economic blocs in the world. Every day, I work to support a strong, united, and peaceful Europe. Strengthening our ties with Europe serves both American and European goals as we together promote political stability, and economic prosperity around the world. I expect that few Americans have heard my name before these events, so before I begin my substantive testimony, please let me share some of my personal background. My parents fled Europe during the Holocaust. Escaping the atrocities of that time, my parents left Germany for Uruguay and then, in 1953, emigrated to Seattle, Washington, where I was born and raised. Like so many immigrants, my family was eager for freedom and hungry for opportunity. They raised my sister and me to be humble, hardworking, and patriotic, and I am forever grateful for the sacrifices they made on our behalf. Public service has always been important to me. As a lifelong Republican, I have contributed to initiatives of both Republican and Democratic administrations. In 2003, I served as a member of the transition team for Oregon Democratic Governor Ted Kulongoski. Governor Kulongoski also appointed me to serve on various statewide boards. In 2007, President George W. Bush appointed me as a member of the Commission on White House Fellows. I worked with President Bush on charitable events for his foundation's military service initiative, and I also worked briefly with former Vice President Joe Biden's office in connection with the Vice President's nationwide anti-cancer initiative at a local Northwest hospital. And of course, the highest honor in my public life came when President Trump asked me to serve as the United States ambassador to the European Union. The Senate confirmed me as an ambassador on a bipartisan voice vote, and I assumed the role in Brussels on July 9th, 2018. Although today is my first public testimony on the Ukraine matters, this is not my first time cooperating with this committee. As you know, I've already provided 10 hours of deposition testimony, and I did so despite directives from the White House and the State Department that I refuse to appear, as many others have done. I agreed to testify because I respect the gravity of the moment, and I believe I have an obligation to account fully for my role in these events. But I also must acknowledge that this process has been challenging, and in many respects, less than fair. I have not had access to all of my phone records, State Department emails, and many, many other State Department documents. And I was told I could not work with my EU staff to pull together the relevant files and information. Having access to the State Department materials would have been very helpful to me in trying to reconstruct with whom I spoke and met, and when and what was said. As ambassador, I've had hundreds of meetings and calls with individuals, but I'm not a note taker or a memo writer. Never have been. My job requires that I speak with heads of state, senior government officials, members of the cabinet, the president, almost each and every day. Talking with foreign leaders might be memorable to some people, but this is my job. I do it all the time. My lawyers and I have made multiple requests to the State Department and the White House for these materials. Yet these materials were not provided to me, and they have also refused to share these materials with this committee. These documents are not classified, and in fairness, should have been made available. In the absence of these materials, my memory, admittedly, has not been perfect, and I have no doubt that a more fair, open, and orderly process of allowing me to read the State Department records and other materials would have made this process far more transparent. I don't intend to repeat my prior opening statement or attempt to summarize 10 hours of previous deposition testimony. However, a few critical points have been obscured by noise over the last few days and weeks, and I'm worried that the bigger picture is being ignored. So let me make a few key points. First, Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I worked with Mr. Rudy Giuliani on Ukraine matters at the express direction of the President of the United States. We did not want to work with Mr. Giuliani. Simply put, we were playing the hand we were dealt. We all understood that if we refused to work with Mr. Giuliani, we would lose a very important opportunity to cement relations between the United States and Ukraine. So we followed the President's orders. Second, although we disagreed with the need to involve Mr. Giuliani, at the time we did not believe that his role was improper. As I previously testified, if I had known of all of Mr. Giuliani's dealings or his associations with individuals, some of whom are now under criminal indictment, I personally would not have acquiesced to his participation. Still, given what we knew at the time, what we were asked to do did not appear to be wrong. Third, let me say, precisely because we did not think that we were engaging in improper behavior, we made every effort to ensure that the relevant decision makers at the National Security Council and the State Department knew the important details of our efforts. The suggestion that we were engaged in some irregular or rogue diplomacy is absolutely false. I have now identified certain State Department emails and messages that provide contemporaneous support for my view. These emails show that the leadership of the State Department, the National Security Council, and the White House were all informed about the Ukraine efforts from May 23, 2019, until the security aid was released on September 11, 2019. I will quote from some of those messages with you shortly. Fourth, as I testified previously, Mr. Giuliani's requests were a quid pro quo for arranging a White House visit for President Zelensky. Mr. Giuliani demanded that Ukraine make a public statement announcing the investigations of the 2016 election DNC server and Burisma. Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the President of the United States, and we knew these investigations were important to the President. Fifth, in July and August of 2019, we learned that the White House had also suspended security aid to Ukraine. I was adamantly opposed to any suspension of aid. I was adamantly opposed to any suspension of aid, as the Ukrainians needed those funds to fight against Russian aggression. I tried diligently to ask why the aid was suspended, but I never received a clear answer. Still haven't to this day. In the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of the 2016 elections and Burisma, as Mr. Giuliani had demanded. I shared concerns of the potential quid pro quo regarding the security aid with Senator Ron Johnson, and I also shared my concerns with the Ukrainians. Finally, at all times, I was acting in good faith. As a presidential appointee, I followed the directions of the President. We worked with Mr. Giuliani because the President directed us to do so. We had no desire to set any conditions. On the Ukrainians. Indeed, my own personal view, which I shared repeatedly with others, was that the White House and security assistance should have proceeded without preconditions of any kind. We were working to overcome the problems given the facts as they existed. Our only interest, and my only interest, was to advance long-standing U.S. policy and to support Ukraine's fragile democracy. Now let me provide additional details specifically about Ukraine and my involvement. First, my very first days as ambassador to the EU, which was starting back in July of 2018, Ukraine has featured prominently in my broader portfolio. Ukraine's political and economic development are critical to the long-standing and long-lasting stability of Europe. Moreover, the conflict in eastern Ukraine and Crimea remains one of the most significant security crises for Europe and the United States. Our efforts to counterbalance an aggressive Russia depend in substantial part on a strong Ukraine. On April 21st, 2019, Vladimir Zelensky was elected president of Ukraine in an historic election. With the express support of Secretary Pompeo, I attended President Zelensky's inauguration on May 20th as part of the U.S. delegation, which was led by Energy Secretary Rick Perry. The U.S. delegation also included Senator Johnson, Ukraine Special Envoy Volker, and Lieutenant Colonel Alex Vindman of the National Security Council. My attendance at President Zelensky's inauguration was not my first involvement with Ukraine. As I testified previously, just 4 days after assuming my post as ambassador in July of 2018, I received an official delegation from the government of then Ukraine President Petro Poroshenko. The meeting took place at the U.S. mission in Brussels and was prearranged by my career EU mission staff. And I've had several meetings since then in Brussels. Later, in February of 2019, I worked well with U.S. Ambassador Marie Yovanovitch in making my first official visit to Ukraine for a U.S. Navy visit to the strategic Black Sea port of Odessa. And the reason I raise these prior Ukraine activities, the meetings in Brussels, my visit to Odessa, is to emphasize that Ukraine has been a part of my portfolio from my very first days as the U.S. ambassador. Any claim that I somehow muscled my way into the Ukraine relationship is simply false. During the Zelensky inauguration on May 20th, the U.S. delegation developed a very positive view of the Ukraine government. We were impressed by President Zelensky's desire to promote a stronger relationship with the United States. We admired his commitment to reform, and we were excited about the possibility of Ukraine making the changes necessary to support a greater Western economic investment. And we were excited that Ukraine might, after years and years of lip service, finally get serious about addressing its own well-known corruption problems. With that enthusiasm, we returned to the White House on May 23rd to brief President Trump. We advised the President of the strategic importance of Ukraine and the value of strengthening the relationship with President Zelensky. To support this reformer, we asked the White House for two things. First, a working phone call between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, and second, a working Oval Office visit. In our view, both were vital to cementing the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, demonstrating support for Ukraine in the face of Russian aggression, and advancing broader U.S. foreign policy interests. Unfortunately, President Trump was skeptical. He expressed concerns that the Ukrainian government was not serious about reform, and he even mentioned that Ukraine tried to take him down in the last election. In response to our persistent efforts in that meeting to change his views, President Trump directed us to, quote, talk with Rudy. We understood that talk with Rudy meant talk with Mr. Rudy Giuliani, the president's personal lawyer. Let me say again, we weren't happy with the president's directive to talk with Rudy. We did not want to involve Mr. Giuliani. I believed then, as I do now, that the men and women of the State Department, not the president's personal lawyer, should take responsibility for Ukraine matters. Nonetheless, based on the president's direction, we were faced with a choice. We could abandon the efforts to schedule the White House phone call and a White House visit between Presidents Trump and Zelensky, which was unquestionably in our foreign policy interest, or we could do as President Trump had directed and talk with Rudy. We chose the latter course, not because we liked it, but because it was the only constructive path open to us. Over the course of the next several months, Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I were in communication with Mr. Giuliani. Secretary Perry volunteered to make the initial calls with Mr. Giuliani, given their prior relationship. Ambassador Volker made several of the early calls and generally informed us of what was discussed. I first communicated with Mr. Giuliani in early August, several months later. Mr. Giuliani emphasized that the president wanted a public statement from President Zelensky committing Ukraine to look into the corruption issues. Mr. Giuliani specifically mentioned the 2016 election, including the DNC server, and Burisma as two topics of importance to the president. We kept the leadership of the State Department and the NSC informed of our activities, and that included communications with Secretary of State Pompeo, his counselor Ulrich Brechtbull, his executive secretary Lisa Kenna, and also communications with Ambassador Bolton, Dr. Hill, Mr. Morrison, and their staff at the NSC. They knew what we were doing and why. On July 10th, 2019, senior Ukrainian national security officials met with Ambassador Bolton, Ambassador Volker, Dr. Hill, Secretary Perry, myself, and several others in Washington, D.C. During that meeting, we all discussed the importance of the two action items I identified earlier. One, a working phone call, and two, a White House meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky. From my perspective, the July 10th meeting was a positive step toward accomplishing our shared goals. While I am now aware of accounts of the meeting from Dr. Hill and Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, their recollections of those events simply don't square with my own, or with those of Ambassador Volker or Secretary Perry. I recall mentioning the prerequisite of investigations before any White House call or meeting, but I do not recall any yelling or screaming or abrupt terminations as others have said. Instead, after the meeting, Ambassador Bolton walked outside with our group, and we all took some great pictures together outside on the White House lawn. More important, those recollections of protests do not square with the documentary record of our interactions with the NSC in the days and weeks that followed. We kept the NSC apprised of our efforts, including, specifically, our efforts to secure a public statement from the Ukrainians that would satisfy President Trump's concerns. For example, on July 13th, and this is 3 days after that July 10th meeting, I emailed Tim Morrison. He had just taken over Dr. Hill's post as the NSC Eurasia Director, and I met him that day for the Mr. Giuliani also expressed those requests directly to us. We all understood that these prerequisites for the White House call and the White House meeting reflected President Trump's desires and requirements. Within my State Department emails, there is a July 19th email. This email was sent to Secretary Pompeo, Secretary Perry, Brian McCormick, who is Secretary Perry's Chief of Staff at the time, Ms. Kenna, who is the Executive Secretariat for Secretary Pompeo, Chief of Staff Mulvaney, and Mr. Mulvaney's Senior Advisor, Rob Blair. A lot of senior officials. Here is my exact quote from that email. I talked to Zelensky just now. He is prepared to receive POTUS's call. We'll assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will turn over every stone. He would greatly appreciate a call prior to Sunday so that he can put out some media about a friendly and productive call, no details, prior to Ukraine election on Sunday. Chief of Staff Mulvaney responded, I asked the NSC to set it up for tomorrow. Everyone was in the loop. It was no secret. Everyone was informed via email on July 19th, days before the presidential call. As I communicated to the team, I told President Zelensky in advance that assurances to run a fully transparent investigation and turn over every stone were necessary in his call with President Trump. On July 19th, in a WhatsApp message between Ambassador Taylor, Ambassador Volker, and me, Ambassador Volker stated, had breakfast with Rudy this morning. That's Ambassador Volker and Rudy Giuliani. Teeing up call with Yermak Monday. That's Senior Advisor Andrei Yermak. Must have helped. Most important is for Zelensky to say that he will help investigation and address any specific personnel issues, if there are any. On August 10th, the next day, Mr. Yermak texted me, once we have a date, which is a date for the White House meeting, we will call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of the U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling in investigations. This is from Mr. Yermak to me. The following day, August 11th, and this is critical, I sent an email to Counselor Breckbull and Lisa Kenna. Lisa Kenna was frequently used as the pathway to Secretary Pompeo, as sometimes he preferred to receive his emails through her. She would print them out and put them in front of him. With the subject Ukraine, I wrote, Mike, referring to Mike Pompeo, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Zelensky to be delivered for our review in a day or two. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough, the boss being the president, to authorize an invitation. Zelensky plans to have a big press conference on the openness subject, including specifics next week, all of which referred to the 2016 and the Burisma. Ms. Kenna replied, Gordon, I'll pass to the secretary. Thank you. Again, everyone was in the loop. Curiously, and this was very interesting to me, on August 26th, shortly before his visit to Kiev, Ambassador Bolton's office requested Mr. Giuliani's contact information from me. I sent Ambassador Bolton the information directly. They requested Mr. Giuliani's contact information on August 26th. I was first informed that the White House was withholding security aid to Ukraine during conversations with Ambassador Taylor on July 18th, 2019. However, as I testified before, I was never able to obtain a clear answer regarding the specific reason for the hold, whether it was bureaucratic in nature, which often happens, or reflected some other concern in the interagency process. I never participated in any of the subsequent DOD or DOS review meetings that others have described, so I can't speak to what was discussed in those meetings. Nonetheless, before the September 1st Warsaw meeting, the Ukrainians had become aware that security funds had yet to be dispersed. In the absence of any credible explanation for the hold, I came to the conclusion that the aid, like the White House visit, was jeopardized. In preparation for the September 1 Warsaw meeting, I asked Secretary Pompeo whether a face-to-face conversation between Trump and Zelensky would help to break the logjam. And this was when President Trump was still intending to travel to Warsaw. Specifically, on August 22nd, I emailed Secretary Pompeo directly, copying Secretariat Kenna. I wrote, and this is my email to Secretary Pompeo, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place in mid-September, that Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS in the U.S. Hopefully that will help break the logjam. The Secretary replied, yes. I followed up the next day asking to get 10 to 15 minutes on the Warsaw schedule for this. I said we'd like to know when it's locked so that I can tell Zelensky and brief him. Executive Secretary Kenna replied, I will try for sure. Moreover, given my concerns about the security aid, I have no reason to dispute that portion of Senator Johnson's recent letter in which he recalls conversations he and I had on August 30th. By the end of August, my belief was that if Ukraine did something to demonstrate a serious intention to fight corruption, and specifically addressing Burisma and the 2016, then the hold on military aid would be lifted. There was a September 1st meeting with President Zelensky in Warsaw. Unfortunately, President Trump's attendance at the Warsaw meeting was canceled due to Hurricane Dorian. Vice President Pence attended instead. I mentioned to Vice President Pence before the meetings with the Ukrainians that I had concerns that the delay in aid had become tied to the issue of investigations. I recall mentioning that before the Zelensky meeting. During the actual meeting, President Zelensky raised the issue of security assistance directly with Vice President Pence, and the Vice President said that he would speak to President Trump about it. Based on my previous communication with Secretary Pompeo, I felt comfortable sharing my concerns with Mr. Yermak. It was a very, very brief pull-aside conversation that happened within a few seconds. I told Mr. Yermak that I believed that the resumption of U.S. aid would likely not occur until Ukraine took some kind of action on the public statement that we had been discussing for many weeks. As my other State Department colleagues have testified, this security aid was critical to Ukraine's defense and should not have been delayed. I expressed this view to many during this period, but my goal at the time was to do what was necessary to get the aid released, to break the logjam. I believed that the public statement we had been discussing for weeks was essential to advancing that goal. You know, I really regret that the Ukrainians were placed in that predicament, but I do not regret doing what I could to try to break the logjam and to solve the problem. I mentioned at the outset that throughout these events, we kept State Department leadership and others apprised of what we were doing. State Department was fully supportive of our engagement in Ukraine efforts and was aware that a commitment to investigations was among the issues we were pursuing. To provide just 2 examples, on June 5th, the day after the US-EU mission hosted our Independence Day, we did it a month early, Acting Assistant Secretary Phil Reeker sent an email to me, to Secretary Perry, and to others, forwarding some positive media coverage of President Zelensky's attendance at our event. Mr. Reeker wrote, and I quote, "This headline underscores the importance and timeliness of Zelensky's visit to Brussels and the critical, perhaps historic role of the dinner and engagement Gordon coordinated. Thank you for your participation and dedication to this effort." Months later, on September 3rd, I sent Secretary Pompeo an email to express my appreciation for his joining a series of meetings in Brussels following the Warsaw trip. I wrote, "Mike, thanks for schlepping to Europe. I think it was really important and the chemistry seems promising. Really appreciate it." Secretary Pompeo replied the next day on Wednesday, September 4th, quote, "All good. You're doing great work. Keep banging away." State Department leadership expressed total support for our efforts to engage the new Ukrainian administration. Look, I've never doubted the strategic value of strengthening our alliance with Ukraine. And at all times, our efforts were in good faith and fully transparent to those tasked with overseeing them. Our efforts were reported and approved, and not once do I recall encountering an objection. It remains an honor to serve the people of the United States as their United States ambassador to the European Union. I look forward to answering the committee's questions. Thank you.
We will now proceed to the first round of questions. As detailed in the memo provided to committee members, there will be 45 minutes of questions conducted by the chairman or majority counsel, followed by 45 minutes for the ranking member or minority counsel. Following that, unless I specify additional equal time for extended questioning, we will proceed under the 5-minute rule, and every member will have the chance to ask questions. I recognize myself or majority counsel for the first round of questions. Mr. Sondland, there's a lot of new material in your opening statement for us to get through, but I want to start with a few top-line questions before passing it over to Mr. Goldman. In your deposition, you testified that you found yourself on a continuum that became more insidious over time. Can you describe what you mean by this continuum of insidiousness?
Well, Mr. Chairman, when we left the Oval Office, I believe on May 23rd, the request was very generic for an investigation of corruption in a very vanilla sense and dealing with some of the oligarch problems in Ukraine, which were long-standing problems. And then as time went on, more specific items got added to the menu, including the Burisma and 2016 election meddling specifically, the DNC server specifically. And over this continuum, it became more and more difficult to secure the White House meeting because more conditions were being placed on the White House meeting.
And then, of course, on July 25th, although you were not privy to the call, another condition was added, that being the investigation of the Bidens.
I was not privy to the call, and I did not know that the condition of investigating the Bidens was a condition. Correct.
You saw that in the call record, correct?
It was not in any record I received.
But when you did
Yes.
see,
I saw that in September, correct.
So on this continuum, the beginning of the continuum begins on May 23rd when the President instructs you to talk to Rudy?
Correct.
And you understood that as a direction by the President that you needed to satisfy the concerns that Rudy Giuliani would express to you about what the President wanted in Ukraine?
Not to me, to the entire group, Volker, Perry, and myself, correct.
Now, in your opening statement, you confirm that there was a quid pro quo between the White House meeting and the investigations into Burisma and the 2016 election that Giuliani was publicly promoting. Is that right?
Correct.
And in fact, you say that other senior officials in the State Department and the Chiefs of Staff's office, including Mick Mulvaney, Secretary Pompeo, were aware of this quid pro quo, that in order to get the White House meeting, there were going to have to be these investigations the President wanted.
Correct.
And those, again, are investigations into 2016 and Burisma / the Bidens.
2016 Burisma, the Bidens did not come up.
But you would ultimately learn that Burisma meant the Bidens when you saw the call record, correct?
Of course, today I know exactly what it means. I didn't know at the time.
And then on July 26th, you confirm you did indeed have the conversation with President Trump from a restaurant in Kyiv that David Holmes testified about last week. Is that right?
Correct.
And you have no reason to doubt Mr. Holmes' recounting of your conversation with the President?
The only part of Mr. Holmes' recounting that I take exception with is I do not recall mentioning the Bidens. That did not enter my mind. It was Burisma in 2016 elections.
You have no reason to believe that Mr. Holmes would make that up if that's what he recalls you saying? You have no reason to question that, do you?
I don't recall saying Biden. I never recall saying Biden.
But the rest of Mr. Holmes' recollection is consistent with your own?
Well, I can't testify as to what Mr. Holmes might or might not have heard through the phone. I don't know how he heard the conversation.
Are you familiar with his testimony?
Vaguely, yes.
And the only exception you take is to the mention of the name Biden?
Correct.
And I think you said in your testimony this morning that not only is it correct that the President brought up with you investigations on the phone the day after the July 25th call, but you would have been surprised had he not brought that up. Is that right?
Right, because we had been hearing about it from Rudy, and we presumed Rudy was getting it from the President. So it seemed like a logical conclusion.
Mr. Holmes also testified that you told him President Trump doesn't care about Ukraine. He only cares about big stuff that relates to him personally. I take it from your comment you don't dispute that part of the conversation.
Well, he made that clear in the May 23rd meeting that he was not particularly fond of Ukraine, and we had a lot of heavy lifting to do to get him to engage.
So you don't dispute that part of Mr. Holmes' recollection?
No.
In August, when you worked with Rudy Giuliani and a top Ukrainian aide to draft a public statement for President Zelensky to issue that includes the announcement of investigations into Burisma, you understood that was required by President Trump before he would grant a White House meeting to President Zelensky?
That's correct.
And the Ukrainians understood that as well?
I believe they did.
And you informed Secretary Pompeo about that statement as well?
I did.
Later in August, you told Secretary Pompeo that President Zelensky would be prepared to tell President Trump that his new justice officials would be able to announce matters of interest to the President, which could break the logjam. When you say matters of interest to the President, you mean the investigations that President Trump wanted. Is that right?
Correct.
And that involved 2016 and Burisma or the Bidens?
2016 and Burisma.
And when you're talking here about breaking the logjam, you're talking about the logjam over the security assistance, correct?
I was talking logjam generically because nothing was moving.
But that included the security assistance, did it not?
Correct.
And based on the context of that email, this was not the first time you had discussed these investigations with Secretary Pompeo, was it?
No.
he was aware of the connections that you were making between the investigations and the White House meeting and security assistance?
Yes.
Did he ever take issue with you and say, no, that connection is not there or you're wrong?
Not that I recall.
Now, you mentioned that you also had a conversation with Vice President Pence before his meeting with President Zelensky in Warsaw, and that you raised the concern you had as well that the security assistance was being withheld because of the president's desire to get a commitment from Zelensky to pursue these political investigations. What did you say to the Vice President?
I was in a briefing with several people, and I just spoke up and I said, it appears that everything is stalled until this statement gets made, words to that effect, and that's what I believe to be the case based on the work that the three of us had been doing, Volker, Perry, and myself. And the Vice President nodded like, he heard what I said, and that was pretty much it, as I recall.
And you understood that the Ukrainians were going to raise the security assistance with the Vice President at this meeting?
I didn't know what they were going to raise, but they in fact did raise it, Mr. Chairman.
Well, it was public by that point that there was a hold on the security assistance, correct?
Yeah, but I didn't know what they were going to raise. I didn't get a pre-brief from the Ukrainians.
Well, you knew, certainly they were concerned about the hold on the security assistance, right?
They were concerned, obviously.
And you wanted to help prepare the Vice President for the meeting by letting him know what you thought was responsible for the hold on the security assistance.
That's fair.
Do you recall anything else the Vice President said other than nodding his head when you made him aware of this fact?
No, I don't have a readout of that meeting, so I can't remember anything else.
And it was immediately after this meeting between the Vice President and Zelensky that you went to speak with Yermak, and you told him similarly that in order to release the military assistance, they were going to have to publicly announce these investigations.
Yeah, much has been made of that meeting, and it really wasn't a meeting. What happened was everyone got up after the bilateral meeting between President Zelensky and Vice President Pence, and people do what they normally do. They get up, they mill around, they shake hands, and I don't know if I came over to Yermak or he came over to me, but he said, what's going on here? And I said, I don't know. It might all be tied together now. I have no idea. I was presuming that it was, but it was a very short conversation.
Well, in that short conversation, as you would later relay to Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor, you informed Mr. Yermak that they would need to announce these investigations in order to get the aid, did you not?
Well, Mr. Yermak was already working on those or on the statement about the investigations.
And you confirmed for him that he needed to get it done if they were going to get the military aid.
I likely did.
Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor have also related a conversation you had with the President following the Warsaw meeting, in which the President relayed to you that there was no quid pro quo, but nevertheless, unless Zelensky went to the mic and announced these investigations, there would be a stalemate over the aid. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And that was an accurate reflection of your discussion with the President.
Well, that email was not artfully written, I'm the first to admit. What I was trying to convey to Ambassador Taylor after his frantic emails to me and to others about the security assistance, which, by the way, I agreed with him. I thought it was a very bad idea to hold that money. I finally called the President. I believe it was on the 9th of September. I can't find the records, and they won't provide them to me. But I believe I just asked him an open-ended question, Mr. Chairman. What do you want from Ukraine? I keep hearing all these different ideas and theories and this and that. What do you want? And it was a very short, abrupt conversation. He was not in a good mood. And he just said, I want nothing. I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. Something to that effect. So I typed out a text to Ambassador Taylor, and my reason for telling him this was not to defend what the President was saying, not to opine on whether the President was being truthful or untruthful, but simply to relay, I've gone as far as I can go. This is the final word that I heard from the President of the United States. If you're still concerned, you, Ambassador Taylor, are still concerned, please get a hold of the Secretary. Maybe he can help.
Ambassador, I'm not asking about your text message. I'm asking about your conversations with Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor after you spoke with the President, either in that call or in a different call.
I'm confused, Mr. Chairman. Which conversations with Mr. Morrison and Mr. Taylor?
Well, Mr. Morrison testified that you related a conversation you had with the President in which the President told you no quid pro quo, but President Zelensky must go to a microphone and announce these investigations, and that he should want to. Similarly, you told Ambassador Taylor that while the President said no quid pro quo, unless Zelensky announced these investigations, they would be at a stalemate, presumably a stalemate over the military assistance. Do you have any reason to question those conversations that Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor took notes about?
Well, I think it's tied to my text, Mr. Chairman, because in my text, I think I said something to the effect that he wants Zelensky to do what he ran on, I believe, is transparency, et cetera, which was my clumsy way of saying he wanted these announcements to be made.
Again, Ambassador, I'm not asking about your text message. I'm asking about what you relayed to Ambassador Taylor and Mr. Morrison about your conversation with the President. Do you have any reason to question their recollection of what you told them?
All I can say is that I expressed what I told, or what the President told me in that text. And if I had relayed anything other than what was in that text, I don't recall.
You don't recall?
I don't recall.
You have no reason to question Ambassador Taylor or Mr. Morrison of what they wrote in their notes about your conversation with them.
Could you kindly repeat what they wrote?
I'll have Mr. Goldman go through that with you.
That'd be great.
But let me get to the top line here, Ambassador Sondland.
Okay.
You've testified that the White House meeting that President Zelensky desperately wanted, and that was very important to President Zelensky, was it not?
Absolutely.
You've testified that that meeting was conditioned, was a quid pro quo for what the President wanted, these two investigations. Is that right?
Correct.
And that everybody knew it.
Correct.
Now, that White House meeting was going to be an official meeting between the two presidents, correct?
Presumably.
It would be an Oval Office meeting, hopefully?
A working meeting, yes.
Working meeting, so an official act,
Yeah.
correct? And in order to perform that official act, Donald Trump wanted these two investigations that would help his reelection campaign, correct?
I can't characterize why he wanted them. All I can tell you is this is what we heard from Mr. Giuliani.
But he had to get those two investigations if that official act was going to take place, correct?
He had to announce the investigations. He didn't actually have to do them, as I understood it.
Okay. President Zelensky had to announce the two investigations the president wanted, make a public announcement, correct?
Correct.
And those were of great value to the president. He was quite insistent upon them, and his attorney was insistent upon them?
I don't want to characterize whether they are value or not value. Again, through Mr. Giuliani, we were led to believe that that's what he wanted.
Well, and you said that Mr. Giuliani was acting at the president's demand, correct?
Right. When the president says, talk to my personal lawyer, Mr. Giuliani, we followed his direction.
And so that official act of that meeting was being conditioned on the performance of these things the president wanted as expressed both directly and through his lawyer, Rudy Giuliani, correct?
As expressed through Rudy Giuliani, correct.
And you've also testified that your understanding, it became your clear understanding, that the military assistance was also being withheld pending Zelensky announcing these investigations, correct?
That was my presumption, my personal presumption based on the facts at the time. Nothing was moving.
And in fact, you had a discussion, communication with the Secretary of State in which you said that logjam over aid could be lifted if Zelensky announced these investigations, right?
I don't recall saying the logjam over aid. I recall saying the logjam. I don't know that.
That's what you meant, right, Ambassador?
I meant that whatever was holding up the meeting, whatever was holding up our deal with Ukraine, I was trying to break. Again, I was presuming.
Well, here's what you said in your testimony a moment ago.
Okay.
Page 18. But my goal at the time was to do what was necessary to get the aid released, to break the logjam. Okay, that's still your testimony, right?
Yeah.
So the military aid is also an official act, am I right?
Yes.
This is not President Trump's personal bank account he's writing a check from. This is $400 million of U.S. taxpayer money, is it not?
Absolutely.
And there was a logjam in which the president would not write that U.S. check, you believed, until Ukraine announced these two investigations the president wanted, correct?
That was my belief.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your opening statement, Ambassador Sondland, you detailed the benefits that you have gained from obtaining some additional documents over the past few weeks. Is that right?
In terms of refreshing my recollection. That's
right, because reviewing these documents has helped you to remember the events that we're asking about. Is that correct?
correct.
Because you acknowledge, of course, that when you can place a document and a date and a context, it helps to jog your memory.
That's correct.
And so you would agree that for people unlike yourself who take notes, that is very helpful to their own recollection of events, right?
I think you asked your question backwards. Are you saying people that take notes, it's helpful to have those documents, or people that don't take notes, it's helpful to have those documents?
No. You are not a note taker, right?
I'm not a note taker, never have been.
But you would agree that people who do take contemporaneous notes generally are more able to remember things than people who don't.
Some, yes.
And there are additional documents that you've been unable to obtain, is that right?
That's correct.
And I think you even said in your opening statement that the State Department prevented you and your staff from trying to gather more documents, is that correct?
Certain documents, yes.
Which documents?
Documents that I didn't have immediate access to.
And who at the State Department prevented you from doing that?
You'll have to ask my counsel. He was dealing with them.
But certainly based on the additional memory that you have gained over the past few weeks from reading the testimony of others based on their notes and reviewing your own documents, you have remembered a lot more than you did when you were deposed. Is that right?
That's correct.
And one of the things that you now remember is the discussion that you had with President Trump on July 26th in that restaurant in Kiev, right?
Yeah, what triggered my memory was someone's reference to ASAP Rocky, which was, I believe, the primary purpose of the phone call.
Certainly. So that's one way memory works, isn't it? And you were sitting in a restaurant with David Holmes in Kiev, right, having lunch?
I think I took the whole team out to lunch after the meeting, yeah.
And it was a meeting, a one-on-one meeting you had with Andrei Yermak?
Again, trying to reconstruct a very busy day without the benefit, but if someone said I had a meeting and I went to the meeting, then I'm not going to dispute that.
And particularly if that person took notes at that meeting?
Correct.
Or sat outside the door when you didn't let them in?
I have no control over who goes into a meeting in Ukraine. That was the Ukrainians that didn't let him in.
And you had also met with President Zelensky, among others, that day, is that right?
That's correct.
And you called President Trump from your cell phone from the restaurant, is that right?
That's right.
And this was not a secure line, was it?
No, it was an open line.
Did you worry that a foreign government may be listening to your phone call with the President of the United States?
Well, I have unclassified conversations all the time from landlines that are unsecured and cell phones. If the topic is not classified, and it's up to the president to decide what's classified and what's not classified, and we were having, he was aware that it was an open line as well.
And you don't recall the specifics of holding your phone outside, far away from your ear, as Mr. Holmes testified, but you have no reason to question his recollection of that, do you?
I mean, it seems a little strange I would hold my phone here. I probably had my phone close to my ear, and he claims to have overheard part of the conversation, and I'm not going to dispute what he did or didn't hear.
Well, he also testified that you confirmed to President Trump that you were in Ukraine at the time, and that President Zelensky, quote, loves your ass, unquote. Do you recall saying that?
Yeah, it sounds like something I would say. That's how President Trump and I communicate, a lot of four-letter words. In this case, three-letter.
Holmes then said that he heard President Trump ask, quote, is he, meaning Zelensky, going to do the investigation? To which you replied, he's going to do it. And then you added that President Zelensky will do anything that you, meaning President Trump, ask him to. Do you recall that?
I probably said something to that effect because I remember the meeting, President Zelensky was very, solicitous is not a good word. He was just very willing to work with the United States and was being very amicable. And so putting it in Trump speak by saying he loves your ass, he'll do whatever you want, meant that he would really work with us on a whole host of issues.
He was not only willing, he was very eager, right?
That's fair.
Because Ukraine depends on the United States as its most significant ally. Isn't that correct?
One of its most, absolutely.
So, just so we understand, you were in Kiev the day after President Trump spoke to President Zelensky on the phone, and you now know from reading the call record that in that phone call he requested a favor for President Zelensky to do investigations related to the Bidens and the 2016 election, right?
I do now know that, yes.
And you met with President Zelensky and his aides on the day after that phone call. And then you had a conversation with President Trump from your cell phone, from a restaurant terrace, and he asked you whether President Zelensky will do the investigations. And you responded that he's going to do them, or it, and that President Zelensky will do anything you ask him to do. Is that an accurate recitation of what happened there?
It could have been words to that effect. I don't remember my exact response.
But you don't have any reason to dispute Mr. Holmes' recollection, correct?
I won't dispute it, but again, I don't recall.
After you hung up with the president, Mr. Holmes testified about a conversation that you and he had where he says that you told Mr. Holmes that the president does not care about Ukraine, but the president used the more colorful language, including a four-letter word that you just referenced. Do you recall saying that to Mr. Holmes?
Again, I don't recall my exact words, but clearly the president, beginning on May 23rd, when we met with him in the Oval Office, was not a big fan.
But he was a big fan of the investigations.
Apparently so.
And in fact, Mr. Holmes said that you said that President Trump only cares about the, quote, big stuff that benefits himself. Is that something that you would have said at the time?
I don't think I would have said that. I would have honestly said that he was not a big fan of Ukraine, and he wants the investigations that we had been talking about for quite some time to move forward. That's what I would have said, because that's the fact.
Mr. Holmes also remembers that you told him, in giving an example of the big stuff, the Biden investigation that Rudy Giuliani was pushing. Do you recall that?
I don't. I recall Burisma, not Biden.
But do you recall saying, at least referring to an investigation that Rudy Giuliani was pushing? Is that something that you likely would have said?
I would have, yes.
Now, even if you don't recall specifically mentioning the Biden investigation to David Holmes, we know that it was certainly on President Trump's mind. Because just the day before, in his call with President Zelensky, he mentions specifically the Biden investigation. And I want to show you that exhibit, or that excerpt from the call on July 25th, where President Trump says, the other thing, there's a lot of talk about Biden's son, that Biden stopped the prosecution, and a lot of people want to find out about that. So whatever you can do with the Attorney General would be great. Biden went around bragging that he stopped the prosecution, so if you can look into it, it sounds horrible to me. President Zelensky then responds with a reference to the company that he's referring to. And two witnesses yesterday said that when President Zelensky actually said the company, he said Burisma. So you would agree that regardless of whether you knew about the connection to the Bidens, at the very least that you now know that that's what President Trump wanted at the time through the Burisma investigation.
I now know it all, of course.
And at this time, you were aware of the president's desire, along with Rudy Giuliani, to do these investigations, including the 2016 election interference investigation. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you said President Trump had directed you to talk, you and the others, to talk to Rudy Giuliani at the Oval Office on May 23rd. Is that right?
If we wanted to get anything done with Ukraine, it was apparent to us we needed to talk to Rudy.
Right. You understood that Mr. Giuliani spoke for the president, correct?
That's correct.
And in fact, President Trump also made that clear to President Zelensky. In that same July 25th phone call, he said, Mr. Giuliani is a highly respected man. He was the mayor of New York City, a great mayor, and I would like him to call you. I will ask him to call you along with the Attorney General. Rudy very much knows what's happening, and he is a very capable guy. And after this, President Trump then mentions Mr. Giuliani twice more in that call. Now, from Mr. Giuliani, by this point, you understood that in order to get that White House meeting that you wanted President Zelensky to have, and that President Zelensky desperately wanted to have, that Ukraine would have to initiate these two investigations. Is that right?
Well, they would have to announce that they were going to do it.
Right, because Giuliani and President Trump didn't actually care if they did them, right?
I never heard, Mr. Goldman, anyone say that the investigations had to start or had to be completed. The only thing I heard from Mr. Giuliani or otherwise was that they had to be announced in some form, and that form kept changing.
Announced publicly?
Announced publicly.
And you, of course, recognize that there would be political benefits to a public announcement as opposed to a private confirmation, right?
Well, the way it was expressed to me was that the Ukrainians had a long history of committing to things privately and then never following through. So President Trump presumably, again, communicated through Mr. Giuliani, wanted the Ukrainians on record publicly that they were going to do these investigations. That's the reason that was given to me.
But you never heard anyone say that they really wanted them to do the investigations, just that they wanted to announce them.
I didn't hear either way.
Now, your July 26th call with the president was not the only time that you spoke to the president surrounding that Ukraine trip, was it?
I believe I spoke to him before his call.
And that would be on July 25th, the day before.
Yeah, I think I was flying to Ukraine, and I spoke with him, if I recall correctly, just before I got on the plane.
So that's two private telephone calls with President Trump in the span of 2 days. Is that right?
Correct.
You had direct access then to President Trump, correct?
I had occasional access when he chose to take my call. Sometimes he would, sometimes he wouldn't.
Well, he certainly took your call twice as it related to Ukraine on these 2 days, is that right?
He did.
Now, the morning of July 25th, you texted Ambassador Volker, and we could bring up the next text exchange, at 7:54 a.m., and you said, call ASAP. Ambassador Volker did not respond to you for another hour and a half, and he said, hi, Gordon, got your message, had a great lunch with Yermak, and then passed your message to him. He will see you tomorrow. Think everything in place. Volker, though, an hour before that, and about a half an hour before the phone call, had texted Andrei Yermak, a top aide for President Zelensky. And he wrote, good lunch, thanks. Heard from White House. Assuming President Z convinces Trump he will investigate, get to the bottom of what happened in 2016, we will nail down date for visit to Washington. Good luck, see you tomorrow. Ambassador Sondland, was this message that Kurt Volker passed to Andrei Yermak the message you left for Kurt Volker on that voicemail that he referenced?
You know, I don't remember, Mr. Goldman, but it very well could have been.
You don't have any reason to think it wasn't, right?
Again, I honestly don't remember, but seems logical to me.
And if Ambassador Volker testified that he did get that message from you, you have no reason to doubt that,
No, if he
right?
testified that he got that message from me, then I would concur with that.
So is it fair to say that this message is what you received from President Trump in that phone call that morning?
Again, if he testified to that, to refresh my own memory, then yes, likely I would have received that from President Trump.
But the sequence certainly makes sense, right?
Yeah, it does.
You talked to President Trump. You told Kurt Volker to call you. You left a message for Kurt Volker. Kurt Volker sent this text message to Andrei Yermak to prepare President Zelensky. And then President Trump had a phone call where President Zelensky spoke very similar to what was in this text message, right?
Right.
And you would agree that the message in this that is expressed here is that President Zelensky needs to convince Trump that he will do the investigations in order to nail down the date for a visit to Washington, D.C. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, I'm going to move ahead in time to the end of August and early September when you came to believe, I believe, as you testified, that it wasn't just the White House meeting that was contingent on the announcement of these investigations that the president wanted, but security assistance as well. You testified that in the absence of any credible explanation for the hold on security assistance, you came to the conclusion that, like the White House visit, the aid was conditioned on the investigations that President Trump wanted. Is that what you said in your opening statement?
It is.
So let me break this down with you. By this time, you and many top officials knew that that coveted White House meeting for President Zelensky was conditioned on these investigations, right?
The announcement of the investigations, correct.
Thank you. And that includes Secretary Pompeo, right?
Many people,
And, well, Secretary Pompeo
yes,
and Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney.
yes,
And you testified that this was a quid pro quo. Is that right?
I did.
And you, at this point, by the end of August, knew that the aid had been held up for at least 6 weeks. Is that correct?
I believe I found out through Ambassador Taylor that the aid had been held up around July 18th is when I heard originally.
And even though you searched for reasons, you were never given a credible explanation. Is that right?
That's right.
And no one you spoke to thought that the aid should be held, to your knowledge. Is that right?
I never heard anyone advocate for holding the aid.
And now, by this point, at the end of August, it went public and the Ukrainians knew about it, right?
I believe there was some press reports, presuming or who knows, but I think at that point it became sort of common knowledge that everything might be tied together.
And in fact, President Zelensky brought it up at that September 1st meeting with Vice President Pence that you were at, right?
I don't know if he brought it up specifically, but asked where the aid was, I think was more, I think he sort of asked, again, very vague recollection, because I don't have a readout of the bilateral meeting, but why don't I have my check, essentially?
And you understood the Ukrainians received no credible explanation. Is that right?
I certainly couldn't give them one.
So is this kind of a 2 + 2 = 4 conclusion that you reached?
Pretty much.
Is the only logical conclusion to you that, given all of these factors, that the aid was also a part of this quid pro quo?
Yep.
Now, I want to go back to that conversation that you had with Vice President Pence right before that meeting in Warsaw. And you indicated that you said to him that you were concerned that the delay in the aid was tied to the issue of investigations. Is that right?
I don't know exactly what I said to him. This was a briefing attended by many people, and I was invited at the very last minute. I wasn't scheduled to be there. But I think I spoke up at some point late in the meeting and said, it looks like everything is being held up until these statements get made, and that's my, personal belief.
And Vice President Pence just nodded his head?
Again, I don't recall any exchange or where he asked me any questions. I think it was sort of a duly noted.
Well, he didn't say, Gordon, what are you talking about?
No, he did not.
He didn't say, what investigations?
He did not.
Now, after this meeting, you discussed this pull-aside you had with Mr. Yermak, where you relayed your belief that they needed to announce these investigations prior to the aid being released. Is that right?
I said I didn't know exactly why, but this could be a reason.
And obviously, you had been speaking with Mr. Yermak for quite a while about a public announcement of these investigations, right?
We had all been working toward that end, yes.
And so you indicated to him that in addition to the White House meeting, security aid was now also involved in that.
As I said it could have been involved, yes.
Now, I'm going to show you another text exchange you had on September 1st, where Ambassador Taylor says to you, "Are we now saying that security assistance and White House meeting are conditioned on investigations?" And you respond, "Call me." Ambassador Taylor recalls that he did call you, and you did have a conversation. And in that conversation, you told Ambassador Taylor that the announcement of these investigations by President Zelensky needed to be public, and that that announcement was conditioned on, that announcement would ultimately release the aid. Do you recall that conversation with Ambassador Taylor?
Again, my conversation with Ambassador Taylor, my conversation with Senator Johnson were all my personal belief, just based on, as you put it, 2 + 2 = 4.
Well, in his testimony, Ambassador Taylor says that you said that President Trump had told you that he wanted President Zelensky to state publicly as of September 1st. Do you have any reason to doubt Ambassador Taylor's testimony, which he said was based on his meticulous contemporaneous notes?
President Trump never told me directly that the aid was conditioned on the meetings. The only thing we got directly from Giuliani was that the Burisma in 2016 elections were conditioned on the White House meeting. The aid was my own personal, guess, based again on your analogy, 2 + 2 = 4.
So you didn't talk to President Trump when Ambassador Taylor says that that's what you told him? Is that your testimony here?
My testimony is I never heard from President Trump that aid was conditioned on an announcement of elections.
So you never heard those specific words?
Correct.
Right? But
Never heard those words.
And well, let's move ahead because you have another conversation in a little bit later that both Tim Morrison and Ambassador Taylor recount. But in this September 1st conversation, Ambassador Taylor also testified under oath that you said that President Trump wanted Zelensky in a public box. Do you recall using that expression?
Yeah, it goes back to my earlier comment that, again, coming from the Giuliani source, because we didn't discuss this specifically with President Trump, that they wanted whatever commitments Ukraine made to be made publicly so that they would be on the record and be held more accountable, whatever those commitments were.
You also testified, or Ambassador Taylor rather testified, that you told him that you had made a mistake in telling the Ukrainians that only the White House meeting was conditioned on the announcement of the investigations, and that in fact everything was, including the security assistance. Do you remember saying that?
When I referenced a mistake, what I recall was I thought that a statement made by the new Ukrainian prosecutor that these investigations would be started up again or commenced would be sufficient to satisfy Mr. Giuliani/President Trump. As I recall, my mistake was someone came back through Volker or otherwise and said, no, it's not going to do if the prosecutor makes these statements. The president wants to hear it from Zelensky directly. That's the mistake I think I made.
Do you have any reason to question Ambassador Taylor's testimony based on his meticulous and careful contemporaneous notes?
I'm not going to question or not question. I'm just telling you what I believe I was referring to.
Let me fast forward a week and show you another text exchange which may help refresh your recollection. On September 8th, you sent a text to Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Volker. Can you read what you wrote there?
Guys, multiple convos with Zelensky, POTUS, let's talk.
And so this was September 8th at 11:20 in the morning. And Ambassador Taylor responds immediately, "Now is fine with me." And if we could go to the next exchange. Ambassador Taylor then, 15 minutes later, says, "Gordon and I just spoke," or 20 minutes later, rather. "I can brief you if you and Gordon don't connect," speaking to Ambassador Volker. Then Ambassador Taylor, an hour later, says, "The nightmare is they give the interview and don't get the security assistance. The Russians love it, and I quit." You would agree that in this text message, after you had spoken an hour earlier with Ambassador Taylor, that he is linking the security assistance to this interview, this public announcement by President Zelensky. Is that right?
Absolutely.
And in fact, Ambassador Taylor testified that you did have a conversation with him at that point, and that you told him that, just as your text message indicates, you did have a conversation with President Trump prior to that text message. Does that help to refresh your recollection that you, in fact, spoke to President Trump at that time?
Again, I don't recall President Trump ever talking to me about any security assistance, ever. What this tells me, refreshing my memory, is that by the 8th of September, it was abundantly clear to everyone that there was a link and that we were discussing the chicken and egg issue of should the Ukrainians go out on a ledge and make the statement that President Trump wanted them to make, and then they still don't get their White House visit and their aid. That would be really bad for our credibility. I think that's what he was referring to.
So you do acknowledge you spoke to President Trump as you indicated in that text, right?
If I said I did, I did.
And that after that conversation, you were still under the impression that the aid was contingent on these public announcements.
I did not get that from President Trump, but I was under the impression that absolutely it was contingent.
Well, you weren't dissuaded then, right? Because you still thought that the aid was conditioned on the public announcement of the investigations after speaking to President Trump.
By September 8th, I was absolutely convinced it was.
And President Trump did not dissuade you of that in the conversation that you acknowledge you had with him?
I don't ever recall, because that would have changed my entire calculus. If President Trump had told me directly, I'm not...
That's not what I'm asking, Ambassador Sondland. I'm just saying, you still believed that the security assistance was conditioned on the investigation after you spoke to President Trump. Yes or no?
From a time frame standpoint, yes.
Now, Ambassador Taylor also testified that, and Mr. Morrison, both of them testified, that you told them that President Trump said there was no quid pro quo, which you also included in that text message that you referred. But then you went on, and they had slight variations as to what you told them, but then you said that to Ambassador Taylor that President Zelensky himself, not the prosecutor general, needed to clear things up in public or there would be a stalemate. And Mr. Morrison recounted something similar. You don't have any reason to doubt that both of their very similar recollections of the conversations they had with you, do you, Ambassador Sondland?
Let me break that down, Mr. Goldman. The text, as I said, about the no quid pro quo was my effort to respond to Ambassador Taylor's concerns, to go to President Trump. Apparently, Ambassador Taylor had access to Secretary Pompeo. He did not have access to President Trump. So I made the phone call. I said, what do you want? President Trump responded with what I put in the text. And then I strongly encouraged Ambassador Taylor to take it up with the Secretary. And he responded, I agree, when I said that. As far as the other part of your question relating to whether or not the prosecutor could make the statement or Zelensky could make the statement, I don't recall who told me, whether it was Volker, whether it was Giuliani, or whether it was President Trump, it's got to be Zelensky, it can't be the prosecutor. But that's what I relayed. Whoever I got that information from, I relayed that to, I believe, both Ambassador Taylor and to Mr. Morrison.
But as of September 9th, you understood, did you not, that President Trump, either himself or through his agents, required that President Zelensky make a public announcement of the two investigations that President Trump cared about in order to get both the White House meeting and to release the security assistance. Is that correct?
I believe that is correct.
Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
That concludes our 45 minutes. I now recognize Mr. Nunes. Oh, okay. Why don't we take a 5 or 10 minute break?
Thank you.
not want any of these documents provided to Congress because apparently they show, as Ambassador Sondland has testified, that the knowledge of this scheme to condition official acts, a White House meeting, and $400 million in security assistance to an ally at war with Russia was conditioned on political favors the president wanted for his reelection. So I think a very important moment in the history of this inquiry. Thank you.
The president did not talk to him about that.
Just want to make a couple quick observations while we're on a break here, because I think today's testimony is among the most significant evidence to date. And what we have just heard from Ambassador Sondland is that the knowledge of this scheme, this conditioning of the White House meeting, of the security assistance to get the deliverable the president wanted, these two political investigations that he believed would help his reelection campaign, was a basic quid pro quo. It was the conditioning of official acts for something of great value to the president, these political investigations. It goes right to the heart of the issue of bribery, as well as other potential high crimes or misdemeanors. But we also have heard for the first time that knowledge of this scheme was pervasive. The Secretary of State was aware of it, the Acting Chief of Staff Mulvaney was aware of it, and of course at the very top, Donald Trump, through his personal lawyer and others, was implementing it. And so this, I think, only goes to underscore just how significant the president's obstruction of this investigation has been. We now can see the veneer has been torn away, just why Secretary Pompeo and President Donald Trump do not want any of these documents provided to Congress, because apparently they show, as Ambassador Sondland has testified, that the knowledge of this scheme to condition official acts, a White House meeting and $400 million in security assistance to an ally at war with Russia, was conditioned on political favors the president wanted for his reelection. So I think a very important moment in the history of this inquiry.
The president did not talk to him about that.
do come to order. I now recognize Ranking Member Nunes and Minority Counsel for 45 minutes of questions.
Thank the gentleman. For those of you watching at home, that was not a bathroom break. That was actually a chance for the Democrats to go out and hold a press conference, Ambassador, for all the supposed bombshells that were in your opening testimony. I want to get back to the facts of the matter here. And the thing that the Democrats have been unwilling to accept is that their operatives got campaign dirt from Ukrainians in the 2016 election. Now, they know it. They know it's true because we have financial records that show it. So the Democrats were heavily involved working with Ukrainians to dirty up the Trump campaign in 2016. So, Ambassador, I want to go through just a few of the incidents that we know. I know you may not know all about them. You may know about them now. But I want to walk through some of those examples of why the president may be very upset with Ukraine and think that they're a country that's out to get him, as I think both you've said that and Ambassador Volker have said that from that May 23rd meeting. The first question I have is, were you aware of the anti-Trump efforts by DNC operative Alexandra Chalupa?
I'm not aware of it.
So in there was a 2017 article that also quotes a Ukrainian parliamentarian Artemenko saying, quote, "It was clear that they were supporting," meaning Ukraine, "supporting Hillary Clinton's candidacy. And they did everything from organizing meetings with the Clinton team to publicly supporting her to criticizing Trump. I think that they simply didn't meet with the Trump campaign because they thought Hillary would win." Do you know that Ukrainian official by any chance that stated that? Were you aware that then Ukrainian ambassador to the U.S. Chalet wrote an op-ed in The Hill during the 2016 presidential campaign criticizing then candidate Trump?
Not aware.
But you know that now in the last few months.
Correct.
So probably one of the more disturbing ones is the Ukraine Internal Affairs Minister, Avakov, mocked and disparaged then candidate Trump on Facebook and Twitter. Were you aware that Serhiy Lyshenko, a Ukrainian parliamentarian, admitted that part of his motivation in spreading the information about the so-called Black Ledger, a disputed document purporting to reveal corruption by a former Trump campaign official, was to undermine the Trump candidacy?
I wasn't aware.
So you may be familiar, the Black Ledger was used in the 2016 election to dirty up a campaign associate, and later Mueller didn't use that as evidence in his report on election meddling. So knowing all these facts from high-ranking Ukrainian officials, Ambassador, probably makes a little more sense now as to why the president may think that there's problems with Ukraine and that Ukraine was out to get him. Is that correct?
I understand your point, yes, Chairman.
Because you said in your deposition, and I'm just going to make sure this was just read it back to you, on page 279 for your legal team. Quote, "They are all corrupt." This is what you said about your conversation with the president. So this is your words about what the president told you.
This is the May 23rd meeting?
That's correct. "They are all corrupt. They are all terrible people, and I don't want to spend any time with that." And he also said, "They tried to take me down."
That's correct.
When they tried to take him down, I think any logical person that wants to do 2 + 2 = 4 games would say that was in the 2016 election, wasn't it?
I believe that's what he was referring to, yes,
Right.
Ranking Member.
So during all this time, and remember, in the spring, the Democrats' Russia hoax witch hunt is still ongoing. They're still claiming that President Trump is a Russian agent. They're out to get President Trump at the time. his personal attorney is then interested in trying to figure out, okay, who are these Ukrainians that are trying to get to my candidate? As those of us, the Republicans on this committee, who were also trying to get to the bottom of who were the sources in the Steele dossier that the Democrats had paid for. The House Republicans wanted to know that all through the spring and even the summer and even as of today, we'd still like to know. That's why we've subpoenaed the DNC operatives that they refused to subpoena. We sent a letter this morning. I doubt we'll see those subpoenas. We want to know exactly, get to the bottom of exactly who were these Democratic operatives that were dirtying up the Trump campaign in 2016. And they just can't get over that the president would send his personal attorney over there to try to get to the bottom of that. And Ambassador, you had very few dealings with Rudy Giuliani, a few text messages.
A few text messages and a few phone calls.
Right. So the whistleblower trying to put together here with their timeline, they seem to have a timeline problem because the whistleblower that only they know, who they won't subpoena, who clearly Mr. Vindman knows, who they blocked testimony yesterday from and would not allow Mr. Vindman to answer our questions. That whistleblower says on July 25th that there were all these promises being made. Yet I forget what they call it, the drug deal that the three amigos were cooking up seems to be their latest. You're part of the three amigos in the drug deal, Ambassador. Were you aware of any drug deal on July 25th when the phone call actually occurred?
I don't know about any drug deal.
Right. And did you know you were part of the three amigos?
I am. I'm a proud part of the three amigos.
And that's the same thing Ambassador Volker said yesterday. Because by the time the phone call that supposedly the whistleblower claims was the original quid pro quo, has now got down to, we're now a month later where you're involved and their quid pro quo has gotten down to the low level of, well, they want a statement. And you didn't even know about anything to do with, on July 25th, you knew nothing about military aid being withheld.
I knew military aid was withheld beginning, I believe, on July 18th when Ambassador Taylor told both of us that that was the case.
But you don't know about, you were not on the July 25th call.
I was not.
Where the aid doesn't come up at all.
Again, I just read the readout when everyone else did.
Well, we've had everybody's testified that was on the July 25th call, that there was no aid discussed on the July 25th call. So then you're in the process, you have no idea that this is tied to Burisma or anybody else. You say you don't realize that until the end of August.
I didn't realize that aid was tied. The Burisma in 2016 piece was much earlier, Ranking Member.
I'm glad you bring up Burisma, because this is another issue that the Democrats don't want to go into. They refuse to call in Hunter Biden. Hunter Biden to get to the bottom of all of this. He could come in and talk about whether or not it was appropriate for him to receive over $50,000 a month while his dad was vice president. And when they actually were able to stop and get an investigator fired, they could call in Hunter Biden, but they don't want to do it. But let's talk about Burisma, Ambassador. Now, I know you're the ambassador to the EU, and I think some of the members later will get into whether or not it was appropriate for you to be in Ukraine or not. I believe it was. I think you have a clear mandate to do it. But you wouldn't be the first ambassador to actually be interested in Burisma. Did you know that in September 2015, then Ambassador to Ukraine, Jeffrey Pyatt, publicly called for an investigation into Slavitsky, the president of Burisma? This was the Ukrainian ambassador appointed by President Obama in Ukraine.
I wasn't aware of that, no.
You were not aware of it?
No.
So you would not be the first one to be mentioning that investigations should be done on Burisma because it happened during the Obama administration. Did you know that financial records show Burisma routed more than $3 million to the American accounts tied to Hunter Biden?
I did not know that.
Did you know that Burisma's American lawyers tried to secure a meeting with the new state prosecutor the same day his predecessor, Victor Shokin, who the vice president wanted fired, was announced?
Did not know that.
Well, we're not going to get to the answer to many of these questions because the witnesses that need to come in and clarify exactly what the Democrats were doing in 2016, we're not going to be able to visit with those witnesses. And so it's an inconvenient truth that the Democrats don't want to admit. They're operatives that were dirtying up the Trump campaign using Ukrainian sources in 2016, and they do not want us to get to the bottom of it. They don't want you, Ambassador, to get to the bottom of it. They don't want the president's personal attorney, even though he's under a special counsel investigation that they fed into the FBI, that we've dealt with for over 3 years. They don't want to get to the bottom of that, Ambassador. I think Mr. Castro has some questions for you.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. Good morning, Ambassador. How are you?
Good morning, Mr. Castor.
Welcome back. You're here all day on the 17th, late into the night, so thank you for your cooperation with the investigation. Did the president ever tell you personally about any preconditions for anything?
No.
Okay, so the president never told you about any preconditions for the aid to be released?
No.
The president never told you about any preconditions for a White House meeting?
Personally, no.
You said you didn't have your records or your documents from the State Department, but if you did, there wouldn't be any document or record that ties President Trump personally to any of this, correct?
Boy, I don't want to speculate what would be on...
Your documents or records?
I don't recall anything like that.
Okay.
No.
Good heavens, okay. You testified Mr. Giuliani's requests for a quid pro quo for the White House meeting, and you indicated that you believe that he was evincing President Trump's interests, correct?
My contact with Mr. Giuliani began, as I said, very late in the process, after August 1st, when I was first introduced to him by a text from Ambassador Volker. So we had already begun those discussions, I believe, with the Ukrainians prior to August 1st, so everything was being funneled through others, including Mr. Volker.
Okay. But you testified that Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desires of the president, correct?
That's our understanding, yes.
But how did you know that? Who told you?
Well, when the president says, talk to my personal attorney, and then Mr. Giuliani, as his personal attorney, makes certain requests or demands, we assume it's coming from the president. I'm not testifying that I heard the president tell Mr. Giuliani to tell us, so if that's your question.
Right, but at your deposition, you said the question was at the May 23rd meeting when the president said, go talk to Rudy. You responded, he didn't even say go talk. He said, talk to Rudy. You subsequently said it was sort of like, I don't want to talk about this. So it wasn't an order or a direction to go talk with Mr. Giuliani, correct?
Our conclusion, and the conclusion of the three of us, was that if we did not talk to Rudy, nothing would move forward on Ukraine.
Okay. And then that was May 23rd, and then you never had any personal communications with Giuliani until August, right?
That's correct.
And Volker was handling, Ambassador Volker was he
Volker,
the primary?
Volker, Perry, and others.
Okay. Ambassador Volker, you testified he's a professional diplomat, correct?
Yes, he is.
And you said you had a great relationship with him?
I do, yes.
You said he was a very smart guy?
Yes.
Ambassador Ivanovich said he's a brilliant diplomat, in fact. You agree with that?
He's pretty smart.
You stated that he's one of those people I'd hand my wallet to?
I would.
And so, did you hear his testimony yesterday?
I did not.
Okay, because
I was busy getting ready for you.
He didn't have any evidence of any of these preconditions. And he was the one most engaged with the Ukrainians, wasn't he?
Yes.
Okay, I mean, you testified, and this was his full-time job, although he was doing it for free.
He was the special envoy.
And you testified you came in and out of the events, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. At your deposition, we asked you about your communications with the president, and we asked you whether there were so many that it would be impossible to chronicle. And you said, no, it wasn't that many. And we went down the path of building a list of communications you remember with the president, right?
Correct.
We talked about May 23rd in the Oval Office.
Yes.
You mentioned on July 25th, before you went to Ukraine, you called the president, but there was no material information on the 25th call, correct?
Not that I recall.
Okay, then the last Friday, Mr. Holmes came in, and I guess his testimony refreshed your recollection?
Yeah, what refreshed my recollection was when he mentioned ASAP Rocky, then all of a sudden
Okay.
it came back to me.
And talking about Mr. President Zelensky loving the president and so forth?
Well, the whole thing sort of came back to me after mentioned ASAP Rocky.
And then the next time, we tried to unpack this, the next time you talked with the president was on the telephone, was September 9th, according to your deposition, right?
I may have even spoken to him on September 6th, but again,
Okay.
I just don't have all the records. I wish I could get them. Then I could answer your questions very easily.
Okay, but on September 9th, at least at your deposition, you were extremely clear. You called the president, you said he was feeling cranky that day, right?
He seemed very cranky to me.
And you said, in no uncertain terms, and this is on the heels of the Bill Taylor text, right?
Right.
And why don't you tell us, what did the president say to you on September 9th that you remember?
Well, words to the effect, I decided to ask the president the question in an open-ended fashion because there were so many different scenarios floating around as to what was going on with Ukraine. So rather than ask the president 9 different questions, is it this, is it this, is it that, I just said, what do you want from Ukraine? I may have even used a 4-letter word. And he said, I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. I just want Zelensky to do the right thing, to do what he ran on, or words to that effect. And that gave me the impetus to respond to Ambassador Taylor with the text that I sent. As I said to Mr. Goldman, it was not an artfully written text. I should have been more specific, put it in quotes, something like that. But basically, I wanted Mr. Taylor, Ambassador Taylor, to pick up the ball and take it from there. I had gone as far as I could go.
And you believe the president, correct?
You know what? I'm not going to characterize whether I believed or didn't believe. I was just trying to convey what he said on the phone.
Okay, and at that point in time, the pause in the aid was paused for 55 days. There was a news article in Politico on August 28th talking about it. So by that point in time, the president had been receiving calls from senators. He had been getting pressure to lift the aid, correct?
That's what I understand, yes.
I want to turn back to your opener on page 5, when you talk about, in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations, correct?
Correct.
And you acknowledge that this is speculation, right?
It was a presumption.
Okay. That it was a guess. In fact, I think you even said this morning.
Well, I want to say that it goes back to Mr. Goldman's point or Chairman Schiff's 2 + 2 = 4 in my mind at that point.
Okay, but you didn't have any evidence of that, correct?
Other than the aid wasn't being released and we weren't getting anywhere with the Ukrainians.
Okay, but did Ambassador Volker clue you in that was the issue? I mean, this is a pretty high, this is a pretty serious conclusion you've reached without precise evidence.
Well, I sent that email to Secretary Pompeo to set up a potential meeting between President Trump and President Zelensky in Warsaw. And when I referred to the logjam, I referred to the logjam in a very inclusive way. Everything was jammed up at that point, and Secretary Pompeo essentially gave me the green light to brief President Zelensky about making those announcements.
Okay, we can turn to that. And then that was your email dated what date?
Do you have the page there?
Well, your email to Secretary Pompeo,
Is it
was that August 11th? 16.
August 22nd.
Okay, so you're asking Secretary Pompeo whether we should block time and I mean, is there any discussion of specific investigations? Is there any discussion of Biden or Burisma or anything linking to aid in this email that you sent to Pompeo?
No,
Secretary Pompeo?
this was a proposed briefing that I was going to give President Zelensky. And I was going to call President Zelensky and ask him to say what is in this email, and I was asking essentially President Pompeo's permission to do that, which he said yes.
Okay. I want to turn to the letter from Senator Johnson. When he heard about some of these issues and the whole of the aid, he called the president. He called the president on August 31st. It's page 6 of his letter. Senator Johnson states, or he writes, I asked him, the president, whether there was some kind of arrangement where Ukraine would take some action and the hold would be lifted. Without hesitation, President Trump immediately denied such an arrangement existed. Senator Johnson quotes the president saying, no, and he prefaced it with a different word. No way, I would never do that. Who told you that? Senator Johnson says, I have accurately characterized the president's reaction as adamant, vehement, and angry. Senator Johnson's telephone call with the president wasn't a public event. It was capturing a genuine moment with the president. And he had, at this point in time, on August 31st, he was adamant, vehement, and angry that there was no connections to aid. There were no preconditions.
Yeah, I had my meeting with Senator Johnson where, again, I had made the presumption that I had made to both Mr. Yermak and the email I had sent to Secretary Pompeo, and we were sort of ruminating about what was going on, and Senator Johnson, I believe, said, I'm going to call President Trump, and find out. And then he obviously had that phone call. I wasn't involved in that phone call.
Okay. But you have no reason to disbelieve that wasn't the way it went down, right?
No reason to disbelieve Senator Johnson.
And now that you've had some time since your deposition and you submitted an addendum relating to the Warsaw get-together with Mr. Yermak, as you sit here today, I mean, are we missing a lot of your communications with the president?
I haven't had that many communications with the president, and in fact, a bunch of the call records that I have had access to, just the short period of time on the call indicates I never got through. In other words, I was put on hold for 1 or 2 minutes and the call never connected. So I really can't give you an accurate count of how many conversations. Plus, Mr. Castor, I've had a lot of conversations with the president about completely unrelated matters that have nothing to do with Ukraine.
But you don't think we're missing any material conversations that you have with the president?
I don't recall any material conversations today as I'm sitting here.
Or with Rudy Giuliani?
Yeah, my memory about the conversations with Rudy Giuliani, whether they were direct, whether they were conference calls with Ambassador Volker or Secretary Perry, is really vague without seeing the call logs.
Are there any other key fact witnesses that would help us, get to the bottom of whether there was any link to the aid and the?
Maybe Brian McCormack, the chief of staff for Secretary Perry, who was involved in and out as well.
Okay. Now, the aid was ultimately lifted on September 11th, correct?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. And Senator Johnson, in his letter on page 6, quotes the president on August 31st. Ron, I understand your position. We're reviewing it now, and you'll probably like my final decision. So even on August 31st, and this is before any congressional investigation started, the president was signaling to Senator Johnson that he was going to lift the aid.
Sounds like it, yeah.
Okay. And most of the other witnesses we talked to, whether it's from the Department of Defense or OMB or have told us that all along during this 55-day period, they genuinely believed the hold would be lifted. Was that your feeling too at the time?
I didn't know, because every time I asked about the hold, I was never given a straight answer as to why it had been put in place to begin with.
Now, what do you know about the Ukrainians' knowledge of the hold?
Oh, that's very vague. I don't know if the Politico article triggered it. I don't know if they were told by Mr. Giuliani. It would be pure, guesswork on my part, speculation. I don't know.
Okay. I mean, during your deposition, you testified that you did not believe the Ukrainians were aware of the hold until the Politico article.
Yeah, again, I think I testified that I was not clear on the exact dates of when when the light went on. There were a lot of conversations going on with the Ukrainians by a lot of people, so I don't know who communicated what to them.
We have testimony from several witnesses that the president was concerned about foreign aid generally, and so he had an appetite to put holds on aid because he was trying to be a good steward of U.S. taxpayer dollars. Do you agree with that?
I'm aware that that's been his position on aid and other matters, yes.
And are you aware that he was also interested in better understanding the contributions of our European allies?
That I'm definitely aware of.
And there was some back and forth between the State Department officials trying to better understand that information for the president?
Yes, that's correct.
And how do you know that wasn't the reason for the hold?
I don't.
But yet you speculate that there was, a link to this announcement.
I presumed it, yes.
Okay. I want to turn quickly to the July 10th meeting. The July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office involving Ambassador Volker, Mr. Daniluk, Mr. Yarmak, has been the subject of some controversy. Ambassador Volker yesterday testified that it wasn't until the end of the meeting, Mr. Daniluk, he said, was going through some real detailed information about some of the plans he had. But it wasn't until the end of the meeting, Ambassador Volker recollects that you mentioned something general about investigations. What do you remember from that meeting?
Well, again, I'm not going to dispute Ambassador Volker's recollection, particularly if he had notes. I know that the desire to have the 2016 election, DNC server and Burisma, were already being discussed by then. Again, I had no direct contact with Mr. Giuliani on July 10th, but through Ambassador Volker. And I probably mentioned that this needs to happen in order to move the process forward. That seemed to be the conventional wisdom at the time. I don't recall any abrupt ending of the meeting or people storming out or anything like that. That would have been very memorable if someone had stormed out of a meeting based on something I said.
Okay, nobody accused you at that point in time of being involved with some sort of drug deal?
No.
Did Dr. Hill ever relate to you her concerns about you being involved in a drug deal?
Never.
Okay. So you were surprised when testimony emerged that she thought there was a drug deal going on?
I was shocked.
Okay. And in fact, after the meeting, you went out and you took a picture, right?
Yeah, Ambassador Bolton or his assistant indicated that he was out of time, that he had another meeting to attend, and we all walked out of the White House. Everyone was smiling, everyone was happy, and we took a picture on the lawn on a nice sunny day.
Okay. Then did you retire to the wardroom?
I think Secretary Perry asked to use the wardroom to continue the conversation, and the real subject that was under debate, and it wasn't a angry debate, it was a debate, is should the call from President Trump to President Zelensky be made prior to the parliamentary elections in Ukraine or after the parliamentary elections? And there was good reason for both. We felt, Ambassador Perry, Ambassador Volker, and I thought it would help President Zelensky to have President Trump speak to him prior to the parliamentary elections, because it would give President Zelensky more credibility, and ultimately he would do better with his people in the parliamentary elections. Others, I believe, pushed back and said, no, it's not appropriate to do it before, it should be done after, and ultimately it was done after.
Okay. There was no mention of Vice President Biden in the wardroom,
Not that I remember, no.
or any specific investigation?
Just the generic investigations.
Okay.
Yeah.
When again did the Vice President Biden nexus come to your attention?
Very late. Again, I can't recall the exact date the light bulb went on. It could have been as late as once the transcript was out, but it was always Burisma to me, and I didn't know about the connection between Burisma and Biden.
And to the best of your knowledge, you never understood that anyone was asking Ukrainians to investigate U.S. persons, correct?
Ukrainians to investigate U.S. persons?
Right.
No,
Okay.
no.
And just to sort of be clear here, ultimately the aid was lifted on September 11th. There was never any announcement by the Ukrainians about any investigations they were going to do, correct?
Correct.
The Ukrainians never, to your knowledge, started any of these investigations, correct?
Not to my knowledge.
And consequently, these allegations that there was a quid pro quo that had to be enforced before the aid was released, and it never came to fruition, right?
I don't believe so.
I want to just step back a little bit and just verify with you that the president had some genuinely deep-rooted concerns about corruption in Ukraine, correct?
That's what he expressed to us, yes.
Okay, and you believed him, right, given his business dealings in the region?
When we had the conversation, I did.
And when you first started discussing the concerns the president had with corruption, Burisma wasn't the only company that was mentioned, right?
It was a generic, as I think I testified to Chairman Schiff, it was a generic corruption, oligarchs, just bad stuff going on in Ukraine.
But other companies came up, didn't they?
I don't know if they were mentioned specifically. It might have been Naftagaz because we were working on another issue with Naftagaz, so that might have been one of them.
At one point in your deposition, I believe you said, yeah, Naftagaz comes up at every conversation. Is that fair?
Probably.
Okay. You had, I guess Dr. Hill at one point attributed to you the terminology that the president has given you a large remit. You familiar with her assertion of that?
I didn't understand what she was talking about.
Okay. But you have, and we got into this a little bit in your deposition, you said that the president gave you a special assignment with regard to Ukraine, correct?
Well, when the president appointed me to as the U.S. ambassador to the European Union, Ukraine was part of my portfolio. What made my assignment larger than just being part of my portfolio were the unique circumstances where there was no current sitting ambassador in Ukraine, and there was a new president in Ukraine. And the discussions that we had, the three amigos, Perry, Volker, and I, was that Ukraine needed extraordinary, as high a level support as it could get from the United States during this period, which we cleared with both Ambassador Bolton and with Chief of Staff Mulvaney to continue working on it. So by extension, yes, if the National Security Advisor and the Chief of Staff approve your remit, it really is coming from the President.
Okay. When we asked you that at the deposition, you said I was spinning a little bit.
I was spinning about something else, I think, in the interview in Kiev.
Okay. And you further testified, so when I said the president gave me an assignment, it wasn't really the president, it was the secretary through the president. And that's where I received my direction, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Did Ambassador Taylor ever bring any concerns to your attention about the so-called, the channel he dubbed irregular?
No, in fact, the opposite. When he came to post, I know I called him, or he called me. I think he spoke with Secretary Perry and Ambassador Volker separately. And in the course of the first few weeks, he was highly appreciative that a new ambassador coming to post like himself was getting the kind of support he was getting from all three of us. Having a cabinet member, a special envoy, and a fellow ambassador all helping to raise the profile of Ukraine. He was highly appreciative and highly complimentary.
And you maintained an open line with him, correct?
Correct. I think there are a number of texts, some of which I have and some of which I don't, where he is reaching out constantly to me and to the others for advice and help.
Okay, we had, I think, tried to count them up. There's 215 or something text messages between you, Volker, and Ambassador Taylor, during the early August timeframe. Does that make sense to you? Is that?
Yeah, I think Taylor started in late June or early July was when he first took post, and I think we began communicating fairly shortly thereafter.
Okay, and he never communicated any concerns to you during this time frame that he had issues with what was going on?
What do you mean by what was going on?
This request for some sort of investigation.
Not in the early stages. He, as time went on, his emails began to be a little more pointed and frantic. And that's when we had very little visibility as to what was going on either. I think it had to do more with the aid and as to why the aid was suspended.
Right. And ultimately you put a period on that issue by having the September 9th communication with the president, correct?
That's correct.
And when you shared that feedback with Ambassador Taylor, was he satisfied that this issue is now behind them?
I don't really know, because he responded when I said, get a hold of the secretary. He said, I agree, and I never knew whether he reached out to the secretary or not.
Okay.
That was sort of the end of that.
At one point in your text, you said, let's get on the phone, right? And you said you're an individual that doesn't like to walk through these issues on text when you can talk about it on the telephone, correct?
I say that to everybody when something becomes more substantive than just a few lines of text. I say, let's talk.
Okay, and did you talk with Ambassador Taylor?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I mean, I don't recall whether we spoke right after that, whether he called the secretary. I basically, Mr. Castor wanted to get the notion across that I've gone as far as I can go with this. You need to pick up the ball. You're the ambassador. You need to pick up the ball and run with it at this point.
Okay. Just getting back to the irregular channel, did anyone else express any concerns to you about this, the so-called irregular channel?
I'm not sure how someone could characterize something as an irregular channel when you're talking to the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff of the White House, the Secretary of Energy. I don't know how that's irregular. If a bunch of folks that are not in that channel are aggrieved for some reason for not being included, I don't know how they can consider us to be the irregular channel and they to be the regular channel when it's the leadership that makes the decisions.
And so the concerns, raised were never brought to a head.
Well, they were never raised.
Okay.
They were never raised. No one said, back off of Ukraine, this is dangerous, you're doing something that's untoward, we have concerns, there was a bad phone call on July 25th, there's talk about a drug cocktail or something. No one ever said that to me, by phone, by text, by email. I don't remember anybody sounding any alarm bell, because of course, had someone mentioned it, I would have sat up and taken notice. Everyone's hair was on fire, but no one decided to talk to us.
When you talk in your statement about in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe, it was your speculation, it was your guess, that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of 2016. And I believe you said that at this point, you believed everyone knew this. Is that correct?
I think once that Politico article broke, it started making the rounds that, you know, if you can't get a White House meeting without the statement, what makes you think you're going to get a, you know, $400 million check? Again, that was my presumption.
Okay. But you had no evidence to prove that, correct?
That's correct.
You know, you stated that you haven't been able to access your records. Is that correct?
Not all of them. And there are lots of notes, records, readouts of calls, can't get to them.
But you've also stated that you don't take notes, right?
I don't take notes, but there are a lot of others out there.
And you freely admit that you know, when last I asked at your deposition, we put together a list of all the times you said you don't recall. It's like 2 pages long.
Is that all?
So, you know, you don't, on a lot of these questions, I mean, there's nuance, there are ambiguities, and we don't have records, we don't have notes, and we don't have recollections, correct?
Right. I mean, it's situational things that sort of trigger memory, especially when I'm dealing with the European Union, I'm dealing with the 28 member countries, I'm dealing with other countries that are not in the European Union that are part of my mandate, I'm dealing with the White House leadership. There's a lot of stuff to juggle. And as I said in my opening statement, a phone call for me with the President of the United States or the President of fill-in-the-blank country, while people who get a call like that maybe once in a lifetime, a call like that might be very memorable. They might remember every single thing about it. I'm doing that all day long, and I'm not saying it in a way of being braggadocio or anything like that, but it's part of my routine day. So all of these calls, these meetings with very important people tend to sort of blend together until I have someone that can show me what we discussed, what the subject was, then all of a sudden it comes back.
I mean, we're trying to get to the facts here. We're trying to find out what actually happened, what's reliable, what's accurate. Bill Taylor kept notes. He brought a little notebook in his pocket at his deposition, and he held it up, and he says, when I'm not at my desk, and I'm on the phone, I use this notebook. When I'm at my desk, I use a notebook. George Kent said he wrote just innumerable memos to the file. Catherine Croft, she testified that she didn't believe George Kent's notes would be accurate. And so, you know, we have all this, you know, back and forth, but, you know, as we get to the end here, you don't have records, you don't have your notes, because you didn't take notes, you don't have a lot of recollections. I mean, this is the trifecta of unreliability. Isn't that true?
Well, what I'm trying to do today is to use the limited information I have to be as forthcoming as possible with you and the rest of the committee. And as these recollections have been refreshed by subsequent testimony, by some texts and emails that I've now had access to, I think I filled in a lot of blanks.
But a lot of it's speculation. A lot of it is your guess, and we're talking about, you know, an impeachment of the President of the United States. So the evidence here ought to be pretty darn good.
I've been very clear as to when I was presuming, and I was presuming on the aid. On the other things, Mr. Castor, I did have some texts that I read from. So when it comes to those, I'll rely on those texts because I don't have any reason to believe that those texts were, you know, falsely sent or that there's some subterfuge there. They are what they are. They say what they say.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. We'll now move to a second staff-led round of 30 minutes. Mr. Volker, I just have a few questions before I turn it back to Mr. Goldman. You testified in response to my colleagues in the minority something along the lines of a lot of people did not make the connection between Burisma and Biden. I think a lot of people have real difficulty understanding that. Tim Morrison testified that I think it took him all of doing a Google search to find out, oh, this is the significance of Burisma. It involves the Bidens. Are you saying during all this time up until the call you never made the connection between Burisma and the Bidens? You just thought that the president and Rudy Giuliani were interested in this one particular Ukrainian company?
Again, my role, Mr. Chairman, was just to get the meeting.
Well, I understand that, but my question is, are you saying that for months and months, notwithstanding everything Rudy Giuliani was saying on TV and all the discussion with Rudy Giuliani, that you never put Burisma together with the Bidens?
I didn't, and I wasn't paying attention to what Mr. Giuliani was saying on TV. We were talking to him directly.
Let me ask you this. Ambassador Volker testified yesterday to a similar epiphany, for lack of a better word. This is what he said. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Does that sum up your views as well?
It does.
Now, I think you were asked a question with a bit of a incorrect premise by my colleagues in the minority about Fiona Hill saying that, referring to a drug deal between you and Mr. Mulvaney, it was Ambassador Bolton who made the comment that he didn't want to be part of any drug deal that Ambassador Sondland and Mulvaney were cooking up. No one thinks they're talking about a literal drug deal here or a drug cocktail. The import, I think, of the ambassador's comments is quite clear, that he believed that this bargain, this quid pro quo, as you've described it, over a meeting, the investigations to get the meeting was not something he wanted to be a part of. What I want to ask you about is, he makes reference in that drug deal to a drug deal cooked up by you and Mulvaney. It's the reference to Mulvaney that I want to ask you about. You've testified that Mulvaney was aware of this quid pro quo, of this condition that the Ukrainians had to meet, that is, announcing these public investigations to get the White House meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of people were aware of it, and
including Mr. Mulvaney.
correct,
And including the Secretary of State.
correct.
Now, have you seen the acting Chief of Staff's press conference in which he acknowledged that the military aid was withheld in part because of a desire to get that 2016 investigation you've talked about?
I don't think I saw it live. I saw it later, yeah.
So you saw him acknowledge publicly what you have confirmed too, that Mr. Mulvaney understood that 2 + 2 = 4. Is that right?
Well, again, I didn't know that the aid was conclusively tied. I was presuming he was in a position to say yes it was or no it wasn't, because
And he said yes it was, did he not?
he said yes it was.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Ambassador Sondland. We do appreciate your efforts to refresh your recollection through the documents, and we understand, we share your frustration in not having the documents to help guide this investigation. So we do appreciate those efforts. One of the documents that you provided to us goes back to the conversation you and the chairman were having about Mr. Mulvaney. And you had been trying for some time before the July 25th call to set up that call, is that right?
To set up the call between President Trump and President Zelensky, yes.
Correct, yes. And I want to show you an email that you reference in your opening statement that is a July 19th email. And who is this from?
It looks like is it from me? I don't know.
It's from you, I believe.
Yeah, it's from me to the group.
Now, who is the group?
People mentioned on the email: Blair, Kenna, McCormack, Mulvaney, Perry, Pompeo.
And who's Robert Blair?
I believe he's a deputy chief of staff or a advisor to the chief of staff.
And you've already told us that Lisa Kenna is the executive secretary for Secretary Pompeo. Who's Brian McCormick?
The chief of staff he was the chief of staff for Secretary Perry.
And then we see Mr. Mulvaney, Secretary Perry, and Secretary Pompeo. Can you read what you wrote on July 19th to this group, please?
He is prepared to receive POTUS call, will assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation, will turn over every stone. He would greatly appreciate a call prior to Sunday so he can put out some media about a friendly and productive call, no details, prior to Ukraine election on Sunday.
So Sunday was the 21st, which was the date of the parliamentary elections in Ukraine, is that right?
That's right.
When you say, will assure him that he intends to run a fully transparent investigation and will, quote, turn over every stone, unquote, what do you mean there?
I'm referring to the Burisma and the 2016/DNC server investigations.
Later that evening, Secretary Perry responds just to you and Brian McCormick, saying, Mick just confirmed the call being set up for tomorrow by NSC, RP. And then a little later, Mr. Mulvaney replies to all, saying, I asked NSC to set it up for tomorrow. Were these the only responses that you received to this email?
I don't know. If I have them, I would show them. I don't know.
No one wrote back to you and said, what are you talking about in terms of these investigations and turning over every stone?
No, there was a chain, and I don't know if it's part of this email or a subsequent email, where I believe Ambassador Bolton pushed back and said he did not want a call to President Zelensky made by President Trump until after the parliamentary elections.
So that would explain why it was moved from the next day, July 20th, to the 25th, right?
That's right.
But Ambassador Bolton is not on this email, is he?
I don't think he is, no.
Now, you were asked by Mr. Castor if there are any other key witnesses who might be able to help with our investigation. And you mentioned Brian McCormick, right, the Chief of Staff for Secretary Perry?
I did.
You are aware that the committee subpoenaed him, are you not?
I wasn't aware of that.
And that he refused to come testify? Are you also aware that Mr. Mulvaney was subpoenaed by the committee and refused to come testify?
I did read that in the newspaper, yes.
Are you also aware that Robert Blair was subpoenaed and refused to come testify?
I think I'm aware of that.
And that Secretary Perry was asked to come testify and refused?
I am aware of that as well.
So would you include them, as well as Secretary Pompeo, as key witnesses that would be able to provide some additional information on this inquiry?
I think they would.
Now, this was not the first time, as you indicated, that Mr. Mulvaney heard about these investigations into Burisma and the 2016 election. Is that right?
I don't know what Mr. Mulvaney heard or didn't hear. I think there's been a huge amount of exaggeration over my contact with Mr. Mulvaney. It was actually quite limited.
Well, he certainly he certainly indicated a familiarity with what you were talking about in this July 19th email. Is that right?
Because I think Mr. Mulvaney was in the May 23rd briefing with President Trump. I don't remember because there were people sitting behind us that were coming and going when we were sitting in front of President Trump's desk.
Okay. Now, you've said that you don't have a recollection of referencing Mulvaney in the July 10th meeting in Ambassador Bolton's office. Is that right? Or
I don't recall.
So when both Fiona Hill and Colonel Vindman testify that in response to a question from Ukrainian officials at that July 10th meeting about scheduling a White House visit, that you said, well, I spoke with Mr. Mulvaney and it will be scheduled after they announce these investigations. Do you have any reason to dispute that characterization?
I don't have any reason to agree or dispute. I just don't remember.
So if they both remembered it and they both then went and spoke to the NSC legal advisor about it, you would trust that whatever they relayed to the NSC legal advisor would likely be an accurate reflection?
Again, I trust that they related to the NSC legal advisor. I don't know whether I said it, and I don't know which conversation. Again, I've had very, very limited conversations with Mr. Mulvaney.
This email indicates that you spoke to President Zelensky and were relaying what he said to very senior officials. Is that right?
Which email again?
Sorry, the July 19th email, where you say, the subject is, I talked to
Yes.
Zelensky just now.
I've got it.
Was there some sort of assurance that President Zelensky needed to provide about what he would say to President Trump in order just to get the phone call?
I think that part was verbal, and then there were a lot of communications going around back and forth with the Ukrainians, and that's when someone, and I don't remember who, came up with the idea of a draft statement so there would be no misunderstanding about what, in fact, the Ukrainians would say and would be willing to say, that we could rely on and negotiate something on a piece of paper.
So just to place you in time, we're going to get to that draft statement, which was in August. This is July 19th, before the July 25th call. Do you remember whether there was a need from any of the White House officials or other national security officials for President Zelensky to provide some assurance of what he would say to President Trump before a phone call, not the meeting, but a phone call was scheduled?
There was initially apparently a condition, but that condition was obviously dropped because the phone call took place and there was no such statement made. The phone call took place, as you said, on the 25th of July.
And when you say there was no such statement that took place, what do you mean?
Well, the Ukrainians never made their public statement prior to the phone call on the 25th of July.
Right, but we're not talking about a public statement. What I was asking is whether President Zelensky needed to relay to you or the other American officials that he would assure President Trump that he would do these investigations in a phone call.
In my email, I obviously had just spoken with him, and he being Zelensky, and he said that he was prepared to receive the call and he would make those assurances to President Trump on that call, and then presumably that would then lead to the White House meeting.
And you had been discussing this phone call for several weeks now, is that right?
Yes, with Volker, with Perry, with Giuliani through Volker and Perry.
And then right after you sent this email assuring the others that he will discuss the investigations and will turn over every stone, the Burisma in 2016 election investigations, Mr. Mulvaney responded that he asked to set up the call for the next day. Is that right?
That's what it says.
Now, let's go to that press statement that you were discussing in August. And you testified, I believe, that you understood that Rudy Giuliani was representing the president's interests with regard to Ukraine. Is that right?
That's what we all understood.
And when you all, who do you mean we all?
Secretary Perry, Ambassador Volker, myself.
In August, you and Ambassador Volker were coordinating with Andrei Yermak, the Zelensky aide, about a press statement. And I want to pull up some of the text exchanges that you were referring to, which, as you acknowledge, helps you refresh your recollection. Is that right?
And I think Taylor was involved in those initial discussions as well.
Well, he's not on any of these text messages, so perhaps he was. He does not remember that. But let's go to the first one. Is it working? On August 9th. There's an exchange between Ambassador Volker and you where you are discussing setting up, we'll try to bring it up in a second, but I'll just summarize for you. You're discussing trying to set up a White House meeting, here it is, and you say that Morrison ready to get dates as soon as Yermak confirms. Mr. Volker, or Ambassador Volker says, excellent, how did you sway him? You said, not sure I did. I think POTUS really wants the deliverable. What did you mean there?
The commitment to do the investigations.
And how did you know that the president wanted the deliverable?
I don't recall. I may have had a conversation with him, or I may have heard it from someone else, but I don't recall, again, without all these records.
Going to the next exhibit, Exhibit 10, where, or August 10th, rather, this is between you and Andrei Yermak. What did you say initially in this exchange?
Hello? Good? Oh, no, that's Yermak. How was your conversation?
And Mr. Yermak responds, hello, good. My proposal, we receive date, and then we make general statement with discussed things. Once we have a date, we'll call for a press briefing announcing upcoming visit and outlining vision for the reboot of U.S.-Ukraine relationship, including, among other things, Burisma and election meddling and investigations. And you respond, got it. That was your understanding of what this statement had to say to satisfy Mr. Giuliani, is that right?
Yes.
And then ultimately to satisfy the POTUS deliverable?
Yes.
Now, the next day you write an email to Ulrich Breckbull and Lisa Kenna. Are you able to see that on your
Yeah, I can see it on
screen?
the screen, yeah.
Okay. What is the subject of the email?
Ukraine.
And can you read what you wrote there?
Mike, and I'm referring to Secretary Pompeo, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Zelensky to be delivered for our review in a day or two. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Zelensky plans to have a big presser on the openness subject, including specifics next week.
And in your opening statement, you said that the specifics, what did the specifics represent?
The 2016 and the Burisma.
And when you say the boss, who do you mean by that?
President Trump.
And the invitation is what?
To the White House meeting.
And Lisa Kenner responds, Gordon, I'll pass to S, and S is Secretary Pompeo?
Correct.
Thank you, Lisa. Now, 2 days later, you have a text exchange with Ambassador Volker again. And this is at the end of it, but the earlier text, which we don't have here, you may recall, includes the press statement, the revised press statement that includes Burisma and the 2016 election. Do you recall that?
Yes, if I could see it, that would be helpful, but yes.
But you ultimately remembered that after your conversation with Mr. Giuliani, you did pass along a statement to the Ukrainians that included Burisma in the 2016 election. Is that right?
I think there were statements being passed back and forth between Volker, the Ukrainians, and others to try and negotiate acceptable language.
Mm-hmm. And ultimately, that statement was not issued, was it?
Correct.
And the White House meeting did not.
Still hasn't occurred.
Still hasn't occurred. But you certainly understood at that time, did you not, that it was the president's direction and instruction that a White House meeting with President Zelensky would not occur until President Zelensky announced publicly the investigations that the president wanted. Is that right?
That's correct.
And you now know that the investigations the president wanted was an investigation into the Bidens and an investigation into the 2016 election.
I know that now, yes.
I'm going to move ahead to August 22nd. And you wrote an email to Secretary Pompeo, directly to Secretary Pompeo, CCing Lisa Kenna, with the subject of Zelensky. And could you please read what you wrote to Secretary Pompeo?
Mike, should we block time in Warsaw for a short pull-aside for POTUS to meet Zelensky? I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place mid-September, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS and to the U.S. Hopefully that will break the logjam.
And Secretary Pompeo responds to you 3 minutes later, yes. Now, I want to unpack this a little bit. You said that in the middle, once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place. What did you mean by that?
The new prosecutor that was going to be working for President Zelensky, the old prosecutor, I believe his term was up or he was being let go. He was the Poroshenko prosecutor, and Zelensky wanted to wait until his person was in place.
So once that new prosecutor was in place, then President Zelensky, should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to POTUS. What did you mean by those issues of importance to POTUS?
Again, the 2016 election and Burisma investigation.
Were you aware at this time that Secretary Pompeo had listened in to the July 25th phone call?
I was not.
If he had, do you believe that he would fully understand what the issues of importance to POTUS related to Ukraine would be?
I mean, I can't characterize his state of mind. He listened in on the phone call and he concluded what he concluded.
But now that you've read the phone call, it's quite clear what the issues of importance to POTUS are.
Yes.
Biden investigation and
Yes.
the 2016 election investigation. Is that right?
That's correct.
Then it says, hopefully, that will break the logjam. Now, by this point, you were aware that security assistance had been on hold for about 5 weeks. Is that right?
I became aware on the 18th of July.
And you understood that there was a lot of activity within the State Department and elsewhere to try to get that hold lifted. Is that right?
That's right.
Just about everybody in the interagency, meaning the national security apparatus, wanted to lift the hold and wanted the aid to go to Ukraine?
Correct.
So what did you mean here when you said logjam?
Well, as I said to Chairman Schiff, I meant inclusively anything that was holding up moving forward on the meeting and the Ukraine-U.S. relationship.
And what was holding that up?
At that point, it was the statements about Burisma and the 2016 elections.
But what was being held up?
Well, the aid was being held up, obviously.
4 days later, you said in your opening statement that you sent Rudy Giuliani's contact information to John Bolton. Is that right?
I did.
Did you know why he asked for that?
No idea.
Did you know that he was going to Ukraine the next day?
I knew he was about to go to Ukraine. I didn't know exactly when his trip was, but I thought it was kind of an odd request, given that the White House can pretty much get anyone's phone number they want.
Now, in this email to Secretary Pompeo, you reference a trip to Warsaw. Ultimately, the vice president went on that trip?
That's correct.
And that was the conversation that you talked about, where you testified earlier to, that where you said that we really need to get these investigations from Ukraine in order to release the aid in the pre-meeting?
That's right.
And Vice President Pence just nodded?
He heard what I said.
And didn't respond in any way?
I don't recall any substantive response.
But you never specifically referenced the Bidens or Burisma in that meeting, did you?
I don't remember ever mentioning the Bidens. I may have mentioned Burisma.
And that meeting was with a group. You were not alone with Vice President Pence.
That's
Is that
correct.
right? And you know that at that bilateral meeting with President Zelensky, I believe you testified earlier, that Vice President Pence did not mention these investigations at all, right?
I don't recall him mentioning the investigations.
So that your testimony is just simply in a pre-meeting with a group of Americans before the bilateral meeting. You referenced the fact that Ukraine needed to do these investigations in order to lift the aid. Right?
I think I referenced, I didn't say that Ukraine had to do the investigations. I think I said that we heard from Mr. Giuliani that that was the case.
So that helped inform your presumption, correct?
Correct.
So it wasn't really a presumption. You heard from Mr. Giuliani.
Well, I didn't hear from Mr. Giuliani about the aid. I heard about the Burisma in 2016.
And you understood at that point, as we discussed 2 + 2 = 4, that
That's
the
right.
aid was there as well.
That was the problem, Mr. Goldman. No one told me directly that the aid was tied to anything. I was presuming it was.
Right. Well, I want to go ahead to, I'm going to go back on September 1st, or I'm going to jump actually ahead to September 7th, okay? When we discussed those text messages where you said there were multiple convos with President Zelensky and POTUS, you recall that?
Do you have the email by any chance?
We could try to pull it up in a second, but you don't remember I showed it to you
Yeah,
earlier this
go
morning?
ahead, though, with your question.
And you confirmed that that likely meant, as you said it did, that you spoke with President Trump. Is that right?
Again, if my email said I spoke with President Trump, presumably I did.
You are relying pretty heavily in your testimony on the texts and emails that you were able to review. Is that right?
That's right.
So certainly if someone else had contemporaneous texts, emails, or notes, you would presume that what they were saying was accurate. Is that correct?
Well, if they had texts or emails, I would. If they had notes, I don't know. Some people's notes are great, some people's aren't. I don't know.
But certainly it would be a helpful refresher to anyone's memory.
Including my own.
Now, you had a conversation on September 7th, according to both Ambassador Taylor and Tim Morrison, with Tim Morrison, where you told Mr. Morrison that President Trump told you that he was not asking for a quid pro quo, but that he did insist that President Zelensky go to a microphone and say that he is opening investigations of Biden and 2016 election interference, and that President Zelensky should want to do this himself. You don't have any reason to dispute both Ambassador Taylor's and Mr. Morrison's testimony about that conversation, do you?
No.
On September 8th, you then had a conversation directly with Ambassador Taylor about this same phone call, where Ambassador Taylor said that you confirmed that you spoke to President Trump, as he had suggested earlier to you, and that President Trump was adamant that President Zelensky himself, meaning not the prosecutor general, had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public, unquote. Do you recall, you don't have any reason to think that Ambassador Taylor's testimony based on his contemporaneous notes was...
I don't know if I got that from President Trump or I got it from Giuliani. That's the part I'm not clear on.
Well, Ambassador Taylor is quite clear that you said President Trump. Mr. Morrison is also quite clear that you said President Trump. You don't have any reason to dispute their very specific recollections, do you?
No, if they have notes and they recall that, I don't have any reason to dispute it. I just personally can't remember where I got it from.
And then you also told Ambassador Taylor in that same conversation that if President Zelensky, you told President Zelensky and Andrei Yermak that although this was not a quid pro quo, as the president had very clearly told you, it was, however, required for President Zelensky to clear things up in public or there would be a stalemate. You don't have any reason to dispute Ambassador Taylor's recollection of that conversation you had with President Zelensky, do you?
No.
And that you understood the stalemate referenced the aid, is that correct?
At that point, yes.
Ambassador Taylor also described a comment that you made where you were trying to explain what President Trump's view of this was. And you said that President Trump is a businessman. When a businessman is about to sign a check to someone who owes him something, the businessman asks the person to pay up before signing the check. Do you recall saying that to Ambassador Taylor?
I don't recall it specifically, but I may have.
And Ambassador Volker also said that you did.
Okay.
So just to summarize here, by the end of the first week of September, before the aid had been released, you had expressed twice to the Ukrainians that you understood that the investigations needed to be publicly announced on CNN in order for the aid to be released. Do you recall that?
I didn't say that they had to be announced on CNN. The Ukrainians said to me or to Ambassador Volker, or both of us, that they had planned to do an interview anyway on CNN and they would use that occasion to mention these items.
And that even though at some point you had calculated 2 plus 2 to equal 4, and therefore you believed that the aid was conditioned on the investigations, that you had a phone call with President Trump that you relayed to both Tim Morrison and Ambassador Taylor, whose accounts of that conversation you do not dispute, where President Trump confirmed that President Zelensky needed to publicly announce the investigations, or otherwise the obvious implication of the stalemate would be that the aid would not be released. Is that correct?
Again, the implication, I did not hear directly from President Trump that the aid would be held up until the statement was made. I did not hear those words.
But you agree that with whatever Mr. Morrison and Ambassador Taylor testified to about the conversation you had with President Trump. Is that right?
Remind me again. I don't want to misspeak.
Well, you just said you have no reason to dispute their accounts based on their detailed notes.
Were they saying that I told them that President Trump said that the aid would not be released until the statements were made? Because I said repeatedly, I don't recall President Trump ever saying that to me.
Okay.
I think what they said, if I could just finish this line of
Yeah.
questioning,
Yeah.
was that President Trump was adamant that President Zelensky himself had to clear things up, quote, clear things up and do it in public, unquote. So what they related was, although President Trump claimed to you there was no quid pro quo, he also made it clear to you in that call that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public. You don't have a reason to dispute, that's what you
I don't
told
have any reason to dispute the clear things up and do it in public. What I'm trying to be very clear about was President Trump never told me directly that the aid was tied to that statement.
But in that same conversation you had with him about the aid, about the quid pro quo, he told you that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public, correct?
I did not have a conversation with him about the aid. I had a conversation with him, as referenced in my text, about quid pro quo.
Well, the quid pro quo you were discussing was over the aid, correct?
No. President Trump, when I asked him the open-ended question, as I testified previously, what do you want from Ukraine? His answer was, I want nothing. I want no quid pro quo. Tell Zelensky to do the right thing. That's all I got from President Trump.
Did you also get from President Trump, as reflected by Ambassador Taylor, that he said he was adamant that President Zelensky had to, quote, clear things up and do it in public?
That part I can agree to, yes.
Time is now with the minority for 20 minutes. I'm sorry, 33 minutes.
33 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador, you've been in business for a long time.
I have.
So if you want to get to the bottom of something, somebody that's running a department or one of your buildings or something, who do you go to?
The boss.
The manager of whatever company
Exactly.
it is. Right?
Correct.
So if you want to get to the bottom of foreign aid, probably go to the people that are in charge of foreign aid here in this town, wouldn't you? Because you're not in charge of foreign aid.
I'm not in charge of foreign aid.
And you've had to testify that you've presumed foreign aid was this or that, and you're guessing that this was tied to foreign aid. But there are people in this town who are in charge of the foreign aid. And in fact, I don't think it's very fair to you at all, or to us, or to the American people. You might be surprised that we had that person here in the Capitol, in a secret deposition, in the basement, last Saturday. Now, that testimony might be pretty important to you before you're here to testify. If you could have read that, your lawyers could have went through that, because it may have clarified some more things for you about your recollection about the foreign aid. So, we've heard, earlier we heard about we had the chair looking at the cameras telling American people, talking about Watergate with their Watergate fantasies that they continue to, I guess they fantasize about this at night. And then they come here and talk about obstruction of justice because they're not giving you documents that you think you should have. So now they've laid out their clear Watergate argument or articles of impeachment. So I just have to remind the gentleman, I know we're not in a court of law because you wrote the rules, the chair here did, but I would think it's obstruction of justice to not give the American people and give the ambassador the right to look at the transcript of the man who's in charge of the foreign aid in this town. Now, I could get into what he said, but the chair could release what he said. And we're not even allowed to call that witness here today. So let's talk about things that we do know are facts. Okay, as best as I think you and I and most people know them. President Trump does not like foreign aid to start with. Is that correct, Ambassador?
I've heard that, yes.
And you've testified that watching over the EU, you have 28 countries, you have neighboring countries that you work with. One of his biggest complaints is the lack of participation that those countries participate in programs around the world. Isn't that correct?
That's correct.
Especially NATO,
Yes.
right? That's one of your, when you go down the list of the jobs that when you get directions from the White House, when you first became ambassador, probably one of the number one things, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but on that, the top of the list was making sure countries pay their fair share, especially with NATO.
Yeah, and we have a very capable ambassador to NATO, so I'm not going to take her lane.
But it's one of the, but
It
you
is.
work with those countries, it's one of the issues that you bring up in your meetings, correct?
It is.
So, now I know you weren't on the July 25th phone call, but one of the first things that the President of the United States brings up is Germany's lack of participation. I think he names the President of Germany directly, that they're not participating in helping out Ukraine, who's one of their neighbors. Is that what you read in the transcript?
I've heard that, yes.
So the whole idea that the president starting out with he doesn't like foreign aid, he doesn't think countries pay their fair share, that's looking out for the taxpayer. But there's more, and we talked about this in your deposition. We talked about it, about how we have requirements. The Congress writes requirements into the law that require you and all the diplomats to carry out the foreign policy of this country for the President of the United States. Before the President can certify foreign aid and send foreign aid, there has to be certification that there's no corruption. You're aware of that now.
I am now, yes.
So being that you learned about that in your deposition, now looking back at clearly the challenges and concerns the president had with the involvement of high-level Ukrainian government officials, including the ambassador here in the United States that attacked him during his presidential campaign, the concerns of leaks that were leaks or just made up stories and conspiracy theories that were spun in the Steele dossier that the Democrats on this committee own. They paid for it. Other DNC operatives that were working with the Ukrainian ambassador here in Washington, D.C. to dirty up your boss, the President of the United States. We're not going to hear from those witnesses. Just like we're not going to hear from the person we deposed on Saturday. We're not going to hear about what the real reason, the person who's in charge of making sure that foreign aid is delivered, we're not going to hear about what actually happened with the foreign aid. Wouldn't that have made it a lot easier for you to testify instead of guessing and doing little funny math problems up here? 2 + 2 = 4. It's great for all the viewers to hear that. Wouldn't it be easier if you just knew exactly why the foreign aid wasn't given?
It would have been easier to testify if I had a totality of the record.
And would you trust the person who's in charge of cutting the checks for foreign aid, the top career diplomat or the top career official?
I'd have no reason not to.
Well, Ambassador, I don't know if we'll get to speak again if we have some more magical minutes, but I'm done with questions with you. I know the rest of our members have more questions. And let me turn to, I know Mr. Castor has some more questions.
Hello again, Ambassador.
Hi.
We'll try not to use all of this time as a courtesy to you. Just want to go through some distinctions between your your opener and your deposition, and some other witnesses. In your opening statement today, you said President Trump directed us to talk with Rudy, correct?
Correct.
But then you and I had a little bit of a back and forth about the president just said, talk to Rudy. And I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, you took that to mean if we wanted to move forward with these types of things, Rudy was the place to go?
Rudy was the guy.
Okay. But President Trump didn't direct you to talk to Rudy, correct?
It wasn't an order. It was, if you want to work on this, this is the guy you got to talk to.
Ambassador Volker in his deposition said, I didn't take it as an instruction, but just as a comment. Talk to Rudy. You know, he knows these things. And you've got some bad people around him. I mean, that, referring to the Ukrainian. Ambassador Volker hasn't testified that there's any sort of order or direction to talk to Rudy.
I don't know what he testified. It became very clear to all three of us that if we wanted to move the relationship forward, President Trump was not really interested in engaging. He wanted Rudy to handle it. And as I said in my opening statement, Secretary Perry took the lead and made the initial contact with Rudy, and that's when we began working with him.
And as to the question of whether Mr. Giuliani was expressing the desire specifically of the President of the United States, in your deposition, you said, I don't know. I don't know if this was coming out of Rudy Giuliani irrespective of the President. Correct?
I'm not going to dispute what I said in my deposition.
Okay.
That's true, yeah.
And we walked through all your communications with Rudy Giuliani, and they're not a lot, right?
Correct.
Ambassador Volker in his deposition on the same question said, I did not have that impression. I believe Mr. Giuliani was doing his own communications. And, you know, granted, Mr. Giuliani had business interests in Ukraine, correct?
Now I understand he did.
Okay.
I didn't know that at the time.
With Messrs. Parnas and Fruman, correct?
A lot of new names I've learned.
Okay, and you had never met with those folks?
No.
And then in your September 9th communication with the president, during your deposition, that was a striking moment when you walked us through your telephone call with President Trump on September 9th.
And by the way, I still cannot find a record of that call because the State Department and the White House cannot locate it, but I'm pretty sure I had the call on that day.
But whether it was the 9th or the 8th, you had this call. It was extremely memorable, right?
It was.
And you've been very honest, and we're not trying to give you a hard time on all the times you don't recall. We're just trying to say that there's a lot of important events that have happened that the committee's asked you about, and you've honestly said, I don't recall. But the call with President Trump on September 9th or the 8th, you recall it vividly, right?
I recall it vividly because it was keyed by the sort of frantic emails from Ambassador Taylor. I had, again, prior to that call, had all kinds of theories as to why things weren't moving, why there was no White House meeting, why there was no aid, why there was no this, why there was no that. And I was getting tired of going around in circles, frankly. So I made the call, and I asked, as I said, the open-ended question, what do you want from Ukraine? Right. And that's when I got the answer.
He was unequivocal, nothing.
What I said in the text is what I heard.
And I'm curious, was that vignette in your opener today?
I don't think so.
How come? It's so memorable, so striking.
I don't know. It was in my previous testimony, and I assumed if people had questions, they would bring it up.
Okay. I mean, this is an example. You know, a lot of witnesses during the course of this investigation have dealt with ambiguities in different ways, and some have resolved them in the light least favorable to the president over and over again. This is an exculpatory fact shedding some light on the president's state of mind about the situation about the,
And I'm happy to discuss it.
So I'm just wondering why you didn't mention it in your opener.
There were so many things I wanted to include in my opening, and my opening was already, I think, 45 minutes or something. It would have been an hour and a half. There are a lot of things I'd like to have mentioned.
Okay, but you only had a couple conversations with the president, and we're trying to evaluate whether it was not purposeful. Trust me. talking about striking conversations. Mr. Holmes, when he came here last Friday in the basement, I'll tell you, he thought your conversation that you had with the president was like the most memorable thing he's ever experienced.
How many conversations has he had with the president?
He probably hasn't had any. But he was energized, enthusiastic about telling us about this conversation. And
So not only did I buy him lunch, but I also provided entertainment?
Yeah, and he conferred with us that he regaled anyone that he came across with this story. And that's, I guess, a great discussion for Thursday. But other than the colorful language, and he was definitely moved by the color, but he was unequivocal that you brought up the Bidens in the post-call discussion. And he said something to the effect of the president's only interested in big things, and Mr. Holmes said that, there's a lot of big things going on in the Ukraine, like there are. There's a war. Ukraine's under attack from the east by Russia. And he puts words in your mouth to the effect of, no, the president only cares about investigations like Rudy is pitching about the Bidens. And what's important about this is the day after the 725 call. And what's reported by Mr. Holmes, and you, to the extent you've confirmed it, isn't anything different than happened on the 725 call. Agreed? From the president's standpoint?
With 2020 hindsight, now that we've had the transcript of the call, the Bidens were clearly mentioned on the call, but I wasn't making the connection with the Bidens.
Right, but with regard to the president, it was just mentioning investigations.
That's all he said on the phone was investigations, I think.
But you told us time and again that you never realized the Bidens were part of any of this, the Burisma, and you talked about a continuum, and you never came to understand that until maybe as late as September 25th, correct?
I don't know the exact date, but it was pretty late.
Okay. And Ambassador Volker said the Bidens never came up after his one breakfast meeting with Mayor Giuliani, where he testified that he tried to disabuse the mayor of anything relating to the Bidens.
And I think Secretary Perry publicly stated that he never heard Biden either until the end.
So when you testify here today that you have no recollection of mentioning the Bidens to Mr. Holmes, that's not just a recollection, that's based on your state of mind at that point in time and your state of mind up to September 25th, correct?
I wasn't into investigating the Bidens.
Okay. So it's very surprising to you that he would mention that, right?
It was very surprising to me.
I want to go back to a couple things in your statement. This July 26th meeting with President Zelensky, earlier in the day from this lunch time event we've been talking about. During the course of the meeting with President Zelensky, did any of the parties discuss what came up on the telephone call?
I don't believe so.
Okay, so President Zelensky didn't express any concerns about the content of the call, right?
I mean, all I heard about that call was that it was a good call. It was friendly, everyone was happy, I was delighted to hear that so that we could now move to the next phase, which was the meeting.
Okay, so you can tell us with certainty that nobody talked about demands in that meeting or fulfilling the president's demands?
I don't remember exactly. Again, this is a great example, Mr. Castro, of where I would have loved to have seen the notes from the meeting. I didn't take any notes, but I know there were notes taken. But I don't remember any heated conversation in the meeting. I remember it being a really, really friendly, good meeting. And that's why I said what I did to the president the next day, which was, Zelensky will do whatever you want. He's very happy.
And you don't remember any discussion by President Zelensky of lamenting how he had to navigate this difficult situation, right?
I don't know. I know that was in the whistleblower complaint, something about navigating something. I didn't remember anything like that.
I want to get back to your...
Gentlemen, yield just a second.
Of course.
Which would be another helpful thing also, Ambassador, is if we actually had heard from the whistleblower and we had testimony of the whistleblower. Then you wouldn't have to be up here speculating as much and guessing, because you would have a source that would have been interviewed. We have his complaint. We could have matched it up with your testimony along with the people from OMB that would have made it very easy for you to testify, so you wouldn't have to just try to remember all of this stuff and chase conspiracy theories around that the Democrats have continued to lay out for the last 6 weeks, moving from quid pro quo to extortion to bribery to where are we at today, obstruction of justice, and now back to quid pro quo. We wouldn't have had to do all that if the whistleblower would have testified. You wouldn't have to speculate about what the whistleblower only had in his or her complaint that nobody seems to know. Yield back to Mr. Castor.
Thank you, Mr. Nunes. I want to turn to a couple of times in your opener, you said everyone was in the loop. And I just want to, these televised proceedings, sometimes we lose track of things, and everyone was not in the loop with your speculation or your guess that in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe that the resumption of security aid would not occur without public statement from the Ukraine. Everyone wasn't in the loop with that, right?
Well, the secretary was, because that's why I sent my email.
But your emails, let's look at your emails. There's 2 emails that you sent to the secretary, right? Better here?
August 22nd?
Right, and August 11th?
August 11th.
So the August 11th email, we went through this before. I'm sorry to go through it again. You said to the secretary, Kurt and I negotiated a statement from Z to be delivered for our review in a day or 2. The contents will hopefully make the boss happy enough to authorize an invitation. Z plans to have a big presser on the openness subject next week. A couple things here. This is only relating to the White House meeting, correct?
Yes, I believe so.
And this is only, this is just investigations generally, making a public statement of openness generally, right?
Well, I think by August 11th, Mr. Castor, I think we were talking about 2016 in Burisma. The investigations generally was really early in the...
Okay, but do we know that Secretary Pompeo knows that?
I think so. I think...
Why?
Well, only because I think Counselor Breckbull was briefed on all of these things. And
by who? By you?
By, I believe, Ambassador Volker, by myself.
That's not what he testified to. I mean, did you?
Ambassador or Counselor Breckbull testified? I didn't know he had testified.
No, Ambassador Volker.
Oh, okay.
He didn't testify that he briefed Mr. Breckbull. I mean, this email to the secretary is talking about this statement, which, by the way, I mean, you said Kurt and I negotiated a statement, and the statement never went.
Didn't go anywhere.
Yeah, Ambassador Volker said it wasn't a good idea. Mr. Yarmark said it wasn't a good idea. But what you're writing to the secretary here is just it relates to a generic openness subject, right?
Yeah, but I think the secretary, though, was on the July 25th call, which obviously I wasn't on and I didn't know about.
Okay, but you used this email to suggest that everyone was in the loop, that like security sector assistance was tied to some sort of act by the Ukrainians.
No, I don't think I said that. I don't think I said that this assistance was involved here.
Okay.
I think
what was everyone in the loop about then?
Well, the secretary was in the loop that we had negotiated a statement.
Okay.
I'm fairly comfortable that the secretary knows that where the statement was at that point. In other words, the 2016 in Burisma, and that Lisa passed that along to him and kept him informed.
Okay, so we can agree that at this point in time, the secretary wasn't in a loop, that there was a conditionality on the security sector assistance.
Hold on a second. Are you asking about July 19th, Exhibit 4?
I was asking about your email to the Secretary on August 11th.
Oh, okay.
There's,
Well, on July 19th, which the Secretary was on, I talked about fully transparent investigation and turn over every stone, and the Secretary was on that.
okay.
So,
But you testified at your deposition that on July 19th, in this continuum you talked about,
yeah.
at that point in the continuum, it was just a generic investigation. Wasn't anything involving,
I think it went, again, I'm not trying to put words in any way, I think it went from the original generic from, May 23rd when we left the Oval Office. We're talking about corruption and oligarchs until Mr. Giuliani started to become involved, and then it transitioned into the bereavement.
you hadn't even talked to Giuliani by that time. This is July 19th.
With all respect, will you allow him to finish his answer, please?
Sorry, use the mic.
Will you allow him to finish his answer?
Of course, I apologize.
We were communicating with Mr. Giuliani through Secretary Perry and through Ambassador Volker. I wasn't talking to Mr. Giuliani directly.
Okay.
Until after August 1st.
But as of July 19th, weren't we still on the generic part of the continuum?
I don't know. I believe by then we were talking about Burisma in 2016, to be candid.
But not Biden.
No, not Biden.
Okay.
No.
And then turning to your email of August 11th.
Yeah, got it.
I'm sorry, we just dealt with that. August the 22nd.
22nd?
Yeah, it's page 23 of your opener.
Yeah, I got it.
And this is where you were requesting a pull aside for the president, and this is when the president was
He was still going to go.
going to go. It was before the hurricane.
Right.
Bump that off his schedule. I would ask Zelensky to look him in the eye and tell him that once Ukraine's new justice folks are in place, Zelensky should be able to move forward publicly and with confidence on those issues of importance to the president and the United States. Hopefully that'll break the logjam. And at this point in time, the issues of importance to the president of the United States were what?
The two investigations.
Okay. But nothing to do with Vice President Biden, right?
Again, I didn't make the connection there.
I want to just pivot briefly to the President's concerns about foreign assistance. Under Secretary Hale, who will be with us later today, testified that during this relevant time frame, there was a real focus to re-examine all federal aid programs. Are you aware of that interest of the President?
I'm generally aware of the President's skepticism toward foreign aid and, conditioning foreign aid on certain things. I'm generally aware of that, yes.
And Ambassador Hale testified, and his testimony's been public, almost a zero-based concept, that each assistance program and each country that receives the program be evaluated. The program made sense, that we avoid nation building, and that we not provide assistance to countries that are lost to us in terms of policy, whether it's because corruption or another reason. Is that something you were aware of at the time?
Generally, yes.
Okay. And you're certainly aware that the President was concerned about the European allies' contributions to the region?
Exactly why I was involved.
Okay. So, as we get down to September 11th, right before you're advocating that the pause be lifted, correct? But
Yeah, I personally didn't think the pause should have ever been put in place.
Okay.
Yeah.
But as we get down to September 11th and you're talking with Senator Johnson and so forth, You don't know with certainty that the genuine reason the president was implementing the pause wasn't because of his concerns about the allies or his concerns about foreign assistance generally, or that he wasn't just trying to hold the aid as long as he could to see what he could, what type of information he could get about those two subjects.
Fair enough.
Okay. I am really trying to finish up before so I can yield some time back. Do we have anything else, Mr.?
I have nothing else.
Thank you. Yield back.
Chairman yields back.
Back the balance of our time.
Let's take a 30-minute recess to allow Ambassador Sondland get a bite to eat. I think the members of the committee might like to get a bite to eat. And then we will resume with the member rounds of questioning of 5 minutes. If we could allow the witnesses to have the opportunity to leave the room first.
Mr. Chairman, Ambassador
Counsel.
Sondland had intended to fly back to Brussels to resume his duties at the end of the day, and so it would be a great convenience to us if we could have a shorter break now and resume with the members' questions and try and wrap up in time that he might be able to make his flight.
I appreciate that, Counsel. We all have a busy schedule these days. The member round of questions should take, I think, slightly less than 2 hours, so I think you should be good depending on the time of your flight. But we will endeavor to make the break as short as possible. If you'd like to excuse yourself from the room before the rest of the crowd. We stand in recess.